They were unstoppable, a tidal wave of horsemen who burned cities, crushed empires, and made kings kneel. The Mongols had never lost until now. In 1260, on the sun-scorched plains of Palestine, something unthinkable happened. An army of former slaves, the Mamluks, stood face to face with the greatest war machine the world had ever known. No one believed they could win. No one had ever beaten the Mongols in open battle. But what happened at Ain Jalut didn't just rewrite history. It saved an entire civilization from extinction. This isn't just a battle story. It's the moment the unstoppable met the immovable. It's betrayal, strategy, courage, and blood. And it all began with a trap. Chapter 1. The Unstoppable Horde. The gates of Baghdad lay in ruins. The Tigris ran red. Smoke choked the skies, curling over shattered domes and broken minarets. The greatest city in the Islamic world, once the beating heart of learning, wealth, and power, was gone. In February of the year 1258, the Mongols stormed the city like a plague of steel. What they left behind was not conquest. It was erasure. Books were torn from shelves and hurled into the river. Libraries, once filled with centuries of human thought, vanished beneath rising black water. Survivors said the Tigris flowed dark for days, not with blood, but ink. Baghdad, the crown jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, had fallen in a single week. To the people of the Islamic world, it was more than a military defeat. It was the end of the world. The man behind the destruction was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. Cold-eyed, methodical, and merciless, Hulagu had been sent westward with a mission as clear as it was terrifying: subdue the entire Muslim world. He did not speak Arabic. He had no need to. His message was written in fire, in bone, and in silence. City after city surrendered before him. Those who resisted were erased. The Mongol strategy was brutally effective. If a town refused to submit, it was wiped from the map. The few survivors were left to crawl, broken and wide-eyed, to the next town with a single story to tell: resist, and you die. They came from the steppes of Central Asia, lean, hard-faced riders with bows stronger than iron and eyes that had seen generations of war. Their horses moved like shadows. Their arrows flew in swarms. The Mongols fought like no one else. Not in lines, not with honor, but with speed, deception, and terrifying unity. Their empire was the largest the world had ever seen, stretching from China to the gates of Europe. But they weren't finished. Not yet. Now, they turned their gaze to the west. To Syria, to Egypt, to Mecca itself. No army could stop them. The Seljuks of Anatolia had been crushed. The assassins of Persia had been wiped out. Even the once mighty Khwarezmian Empire had crumbled like dry leaves in a storm. And Baghdad was only the beginning. Behind every Mongol advance came the same hollow question: who would be next? At the head of this wave was Hulagu, a man who carried no crown, but whose word was law. He was accompanied by Chinese engineers, Persian advisors, and even Christian allies from the Caucasus. He brought with him siege weapons that could level walls taller than trees. He understood strategy. But more than that, he understood fear. Hulagu used it like a tool, as precise as a blade. In Damascus, whispers spread before the riders even arrived. In Aleppo, people packed their things in silence and waited for the sky to fall. Across the Levant, imams prayed with shaking hands. And in Cairo, the Mamluks watched. They were slaves once, bought, trained, and turned into soldiers. But they had overthrown their masters. Now, they ruled Egypt. The Mamluks were not born into power. They had taken it with blood and grit. And unlike the rulers of Baghdad or Aleppo, they had nothing to lose. They saw the storm coming. But what could they do? Hulagu's army was not just big. It was precise, well-fed, and terrifyingly efficient. Every unit moved as if guided by a single mind. Their horses could ride for days without rest. Their arrows could punch through armor at 70 paces. They had scouts that blended with the wind and messengers faster than thunder. To face the Mongols was to face the very idea of destruction. After Baghdad, Hulagu marched west, confident and unstoppable. His next move was to strike deep into Syria and once Damascus fell, Egypt would be exposed. But something happened. In the summer of 1259, Mongol scouts approached Aleppo. The city braced for siege. Inside its walls, people waited to die. But the strike never came. Hulagu had received word from the east. His brother, the great Khan monk, was dead. And that changed everything. In Mongol tradition, the death of a great Khan meant the princes of the blood had to return to Mongolia for the selection of a new ruler. Hulagu couldn't stay. He had to go back. But he wouldn't abandon the front entirely. He left a force behind in Syria, an elite detachment under his most trusted general, Kitbuqa. Kitbuqa was no ordinary commander. He was a Christian of the Naaman tribe, a fierce warrior who had marched with Hulagu across Persia and Iraq. He believed the Mamluks could be crushed. He had never known failure. Like Hulagu, he had seen cities burn and empires fall. He stayed in the Levant, determined to finish what had been started. But Hulagu's departure would prove to be more than just a political detour. It would be the first crack in the armor, the first misstep, the first shift in the tide. The Mamluks saw the opportunity, and they made a choice no one expected. They would not wait in Cairo. They would not hide behind walls. They would meet the Mongols in the field, face to face. It was madness. It was suicide. It was the only chance they had. Sultan Qutuz, the ruler of Egypt, knew what was at stake. He had risen from slavery to sit on a throne, and he would not let his people fall without a fight. At his side was Baybars, a brilliant general with a scarred face and a mind like a blade. They gathered their forces. They crossed the Sinai, and they began to march north. But they would not go alone. As the Mamluk army moved through the Holy Land, something strange happened. Crusaders, Christians who had fought Muslims for over 100 years, watched them pass and did nothing. They let them through. The Crusaders feared the Mongols more than they hated the Muslims. They remembered what had happened to Eastern Europe when the Mongols came. They remembered Hungary, Poland, Kiev. They had seen the writing on the wall, so they let the Mamluks pass. And somewhere in the hills of Galilee, in a place called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, the Mamluks prepared their trap. But that is another chapter. For now, all we know is this: the Mongols were coming. And no one, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the Middle East, had ever stopped them. The sky over the Islamic world was dark. The wind carried the sound of hooves. The Mongol banners rose like thunderclouds. A choice had to be made: bow or fight. The Mamluks chose to fight. But could they win? The greatest army the world had ever seen was riding straight toward them. They had destroyed Baghdad. They had leveled cities. They had burned books, slaughtered kings, and torn the heart from a civilization. And now, they were coming again. The earth trembled. The horizon shook. And in the silence before the storm, the world held its breath. Chapter 2. The road to Syria burns. Smoke hung over the city like a shroud. The gates were shattered. The screams had faded into silence. And in the heart of Damascus, where call to prayer once echoed from ancient minarets, the Mongols planted their banner, high, black, and motionless in the wind. It was not the first time they had done this, and it would not be the last. Before Damascus, it had been Aleppo, a city of trade, poetry, and faith. Its narrow streets once hummed with merchants and scholars, its markets full of color and noise. But none of that mattered when the Mongols came. They did not negotiate. They did not pause. They broke through Aleppo's walls like waves smashing into rock, not once, not twice, but over and over until the stones gave way. And then they entered. They moved through the city like ghosts of war. Behind them, only ash remained. No distinction was made between soldier and civilian, mosque and market. If it could burn, it burned. If it could bleed, it died. Some said the sky turned black from the smoke. Others said the rivers ran red. But all agreed on one thing: Aleppo fell without mercy. It was the spring of the year 1259. The Mongol Empire was still at its height, and Hulagu Khan, commander of its southwestern division, was pressing westward like a storm with no eye. His orders were simple: break Syria and bring the rest of the Islamic world to its knees. And so he did. After Aleppo, Damascus stood next, the jewel of the Levant. Older than Rome, richer than Baghdad had ever been. a place where gardens lined the city walls, where philosophers taught in courtyards, where the Quran had been copied by hand for centuries. But none of it would save the city now. When Mongol scouts reached the outskirts of Damascus, word traveled faster than hoofbeats. Birds in the trees stilled. Merchants packed their stalls in silence. Men who had never held swords stared at the horizon, wondering if they would die standing or kneeling. The people knew what had happened in Baghdad. They had heard of Aleppo. They did not wait to be told twice. Some fled south. Others stayed and prayed. The ruling elite debated whether to fight or surrender, but deep down, they already knew. No one stopped the Mongols. And when they arrived, they brought with them fear unlike anything the Levant had ever seen. Mongol messengers appeared first, holding black flags and letters that spelled out death. Cities that submitted would be spared, at least on paper. Cities that resisted would vanish. This was not empty talk. This was a formula tested and proven from China to Poland. First fear, then fire, then silence. In Damascus, fear won. The city surrendered. There was no great battle, no defense of the walls. Instead, its gates opened, and the Mongols entered as conquerors, not invaders. But mercy was a mirage. Even in surrender, punishment came. Pelagu's men plundered, as they had done in every city before. Mosques were looted, markets stripped bare. Citizens were dragged into the streets, some for execution, others for slavery. A few high-ranking officials were spared, but most were shown the price of defeat. The Mongols understood that spectacle was power. They used terror like a drumbeat, slow, steady, and always growing louder. And as Syria burned, the message spread like wildfire. Cairo heard it first, then Mecca, then every city between the Nile and the Euphrates. Even the Crusaders, sworn enemies of Islam, began to whisper in their stone castles. The Mongols were too strong, too fast, too ruthless. They were not bound by borders or treaties. They were a force of nature, like lightning or plague. From the heart of Egypt, Sultan Qutuz listened. He had once been a slave, sold as a boy into bondage, trained in the art of war by the same system that had broken so many others. But Qutuz had survived, and now he ruled, not with gold, not with words, but with steel. The fall of Damascus was more than a warning. It was a deadline. If Syria could fall, so could Egypt. But Qutuz was no fool. He knew that the Mongols had not left their entire army behind. Pelagu had returned east to attend the succession of the next great Khan, and with him, he had taken a large part of his force. What remained in Syria was smaller, still dangerous, still led by the formidable Kitbuqa, but not unstoppable. And that was an opening. Yet even now, most of the Muslim world hesitated. They had seen too much, lost too much. Their caliph was dead. Their scholars were scattered. Their armies were broken. They feared the Mongols not just as soldiers, but as the end of an era, the end of civilization itself. What could they do? Even the bravest warrior, when faced with a wall of flame, must decide whether to leap or kneel. And so most knelt, but not Qutuz. He called his emirs. He summoned his generals. He did not beg. He did not plead. He prepared. Across Egypt, he rallied the Mamluk army, men who, like him, had once been property, but had forged themselves into warriors sharper than any blade. These were not princes in silks. They were cavalrymen who slept in tents and trained in blood. And with Qutuz stood Baybars. The name would one day echo through history, as sultan, as legend. But now, he was a commander, lean and hardened, his eyes always scanning the horizon. He had fought the Crusaders. He had seen battle. And he knew one truth better than anyone. The Mongols bled like any man, if you could get close enough. But that was the question. Could they get close enough? Could they strike before Kitbuqa regrouped? Could they move through the Levant, through the rocky valleys of Palestine, without being noticed? And perhaps most of all, could they convince their own people to believe again? In the cities of Syria, belief was in short supply. The roads that once carried traders now carried ashes. The wells were poisoned, the fields abandoned. Villagers buried their valuables and fled to the mountains. Families wept at night, not for what had been lost, but for what would never be regained. Children, once told stories of prophets and heroes, now whispered about horsemen with fire in their eyes. Hope itself was disappearing. But in the cracks of that despair, something stirred. Not courage. Not yet. Something smaller. A question. What if the Mongols could be stopped? Just once. Just this once. What if they were not gods of war, but men on horseback, not demons in armor? And that question, whispered in the shadows, began to grow. In Cairo, it became a plan. Qutuz would ride north. Baybars would ride with him. They would take the fight to Syria, not wait for it to come south. They would choose the battlefield. They would strike first. And they would gamble everything on one desperate chance. But first, they had to reach it. The roads to Syria were not just burning. They were being watched. Mongol scouts roamed the hills. Tribes loyal to the Khan reported every movement. The Crusaders, wary and uncertain, might still interfere. And the Mamluks, for all their skill, were still outnumbered. It was not a march. It was a blade's edge. One wrong step, and Cairo would burn like Baghdad. But Qutuz did not turn back. Baybars did not hesitate. They rode. Across desert. Through dust. Toward an enemy that had never been beaten. Toward an army that had turned palaces into graveyards. They rode, not because they believed they would win. They rode because if they didn't, no one would be left to ride at all. And in the distance, beneath the setting sun, the Mongol banners rippled in the wind, black as night, sharp as death. At the center of it all stood Kitbuqa, waiting, watching, daring anyone to try. And soon someone would. Chapter 3. The Fractured Caliphate. The gilded throne of Baghdad was empty. A city once bursting with life became a ghost. The caliph's palace lay in ruins. The voice of the caliph, once the choir of Islam, was silent forever. When in the year 1258 Mongol swords cut through Baghdad's defenses, they did more than topple a city. They shattered the heart of the Islamic world. The Abbasid Caliphate, the oldest center of Muslim leadership, ceased to exist. In one sweeping stroke, centuries of civilization were reduced to ash. This was not just a loss of power. It was a vacuum, a void where unity should have stood, open, silent, and terrifying. Without a caliph, no one could speak in the name of Islam. No one could rally the people under a single banner. Small rulers in distant lands whispered and wondered, who speaks for all of us now? Who holds the weight of prayers and swords? Many answers came. Some tried to fill the space. New courts rose in Egypt, Syria, and even in parts of Persia. But none held the same weight. None held the same legitimacy. In the desert tents of Egypt, the emirs and scholars debated whether to restore the caliphate or forge a new path. But debate took time, and time was the one thing the Muslim world no longer had. Shock had turned to fear. Fear had turned to despair. Scholars fled with golden manuscripts. Merchants abandoned routes that had thrived for generations. The old roads were haunted by stories of Mongol scouts. The air smelled less of spices now, and more of smoke. Common people had only one thought. What comes next? In Aleppo, survivors who had escaped the siege spoke of black banners and crackling fire. In Damascus, refugees moved silently, clutching their children, eyes hollow. They crossed the desert border into Egypt, praying they might find safety in Cairo's walls. But the city's gates only spoke of more questions. For centuries, the Abbasid caliphs had given legitimacy to sultans and kings. They had been the spiritual anchor for the faithful. Without them, every king, every emir, every sultan was a lone voice in the wind. In Cairo, Emir Aybak and Sultan Qutuz looked at each other, each waiting for the other to speak first. Egypt had once paid tribute to Baghdad. Now, it had to pay attention to itself. It had to find its own path. The old system, where the caliph in Baghdad declared who was leader, was gone. Now, power was defined by the sword, not by scripture. This shift terrified many. Without spiritual authority, how could you lead armies? How could you bless a battle? How could you promise heaven or terror to your enemies? Rulers began to claim legitimacy by other means, by conquest, by blood, by survival. Religious scholars who once answered to the caliph now looked to whoever could offer protection. And protection, in those days, came from armies, not sermons. In every city, belief itself was fragmented. In Baghdad, the mosques lay silent. In Damascus, the imams preached sermons carried often by memory, not by scripture. In Cairo, Friday prayers reminded worshippers of better days, days that may never return. The vacuum of power was not just political, it was spiritual. It reached into the souls of people. It whispered hopelessness into homes. It made fathers wonder how to feed their children when trade routes were cut. It made teachers wonder how to teach when libraries were burned. It made soldiers wonder what they fought for, if nobody called the cause just. Into this darkness rode the Mongols. They didn't just bring troops. They brought the idea that nothing stood between them and conquest. They carried banners that meant fear, not flag. They used terror as their herald. Their messengers delivered ultimatums: surrender and live, resist and die. That clarity terrified rulers and peasants alike. Without the caliph, rulers in far-flung provinces sent envoys for peace. Some hoped to protect their towns. Others hoped merely to survive another spring. But many sent no word at all. They were too afraid to speak. The Mongols used silence as a weapon too. In places where no reply came, they assumed resistance. They burned the books, the mosques, the marketplaces. They taught a simple lesson: do not stay quiet. Silence would cost you the world. In Cairo, scholars who fled from the east carried with them maps, prayers, books, and uncertainty. They told stories of cities that surrendered too late. They cried over destroyed libraries. Yet they brought a message too. There were still people alive, still knowledge alive, still faith to hold on to. But organizing faith without a leader is like sailing a ship without a keel. The vessel wobbles. The teachings lose direction. The sermons lose authority. The people felt it. In the streets of Cairo, merchants whispered that Syria had fallen. Mothers prayed for their husbands at war. Children asked why the call to prayer must still sound, when no one seemed to answer who actually called. And during prayers, a silence grew just after the imam said the caliph's might. It was not disrespect, it was absence. Without the caliph, unity shattered. The Islamic world looked like fractured glass, broken into pieces, each still sacred, but no longer whole. Still, some tried to rebuild. There were clerics in Cairo who proposed a new caliphate. They sent letters to the Abbasid descendants hidden somewhere in the east. They proposed ceremony, robes, titles. They spoke of traditions that might bind people again. But no genuine authority answered. Baghdad was gone. The Abbasid line was in exile, scattered, or under Mongol control. In their absence, some sultans claimed titles like Protector of Islam or Commander of the Faithful. But these were words, and words without history felt hollow. Meanwhile, Mongol envoys carried leather scrolls across deserts, promising safety to towns that submitted. Some governors cut off their hands in horror when they read the terms. Some even appeased outwardly, but inside, they trembled. The price of submission was high: hostages, money, tribute, lives. And yet, many chose it, because the alternative was emptiness, destruction, and death. The vacuum of power invited compromise. It invited fear. It invited deals with invaders. And it erased hope. There were few voices brave enough to call for resistance. Some wrote secret letters. Younger Mamluks spoke in Cairo of raising arms. They said, "We may not have the old caliph, but we have swords. We may not have legitimacy, but we have battle. We may not have authority, but we can control land." But these words were quiet, little fires in a dark land. The bigger fire was still out of control. The Mongol army sweeping west, cities burning, people fleeing. The fractured caliphate left no center to resist, no rally point, no common rhythm. It sent messages of panic. It bred mistrust. It forced unity to dissolve into self-preservation. Yet, in the shock, courage still flickered. In Cairo, Sultan Qutuz quietly gathered men he trusted. Men who had loyalty not because of title, but because of shared struggle. Among them was Baybars, a man hardened by battle, yet unsettled by loss. He lost friends in Syria. He felt the pain of refugees. He knew that people were not just fleeing war, they were fleeing meaning. To fight the Mongols now meant to fill that vacuum. It meant to stand as a rally point even if no caliph called them. It meant to show unity not by decree, but by force. Not by ceremony, but by outcome. It meant redefining what leadership looked like. But doing so would paint a target on Egypt. It would say, here is a power rising. Here is a sword drawn. Kitbuqa and his remnants in Syria would not stay silent. They would watch, and they would respond. Because where there is a vacuum, someone will fill it or destroy it. By the time the Mamluks prepared to leave Cairo, rumors spread that they were no longer claiming to serve a caliph. They claimed to serve the people. They claimed to serve Islam itself. They claimed to fill the silence with strength. Thousands came to their banners, not out of loyalty to a throne, but out of hope for protection, out of fear of annihilation, out of grieving and resolve combined. They marched north, not to restore what was lost, but to prove something new, that Islam could survive without Babylon, that it could survive without Baghdad, that it could survive without a caliph if someone chose to act. But would that be enough? The Mongols in Syria watched their lines. Kitbuqa sent scouts. Rumors in the desert spoke of swords sharpening by the Nile. And in those rumors lay the final question. Could men raised as slaves, armed by refugees and driven by desperation, unify enough to face the storm? Could they fill the void left by centuries of caliphs, by force, by sacrifice, by belief? This was no longer about restoring the past. This was about forging something new. In the dusty roads between Cairo and Palestine, faith and fear warred in every heart. And the unknown lay ahead, sharper than a blade, deeper than the broken caliph's legacy. But someone had chosen, and someone had to stand. And at the horizon, where the desert met the hills of Syria, the next chapter was waiting. Would it be unity or total collapse? Chapter 4: Rise of the Mamluks. Smoke settled over Cairo's streets. The old sultan lay dead. A city once governed by dynasties now trembled beneath silent banners. And in the shadows of the citadel, a strange spark ignited, the rise of the Mamluks. It began not with grandeur, but sudden motion. In the year 1250, Ayyubid rule fell, not to an enemy from abroad, but to slave soldiers in their own heart. The last Ayyubid sultan, Turan Shah, was cut down by conspirators in the night. One among them was Baybars, a man forged in battle, with scars both visible and invisible. In that moment, a single blade whispered that a new order was coming. The Mamluks, those who are owned, had served Egypt for generations. Taken as enslaved boys, often from the Caucasus or Central Asia, they were trained in horsemanship, archery, and court etiquette. They grew strong, loyal to the master who owned them. And when they were freed, they became an elite force, fierce and bound by no dynasty, only by loyalty to their peers and their own power. Under Sultan as-Salih Ayyub, the court had imported thousands of these soldiers, known later as the Salahiyya or Bari Corps. They were fed, armed, and housed near the Nile. Though sworn to serve, their loyalty belonged only to their order. When their master died in 1249, they did not scatter. They seized the moment. Within months, Baybars's co-leader Aybak married the widow of the slain sultan. He took power. Egypt's throne changed hands not by birth, but by strength of armed men. The Mamluks had overthrown their masters. They had become the ruling force. But power, they learned quickly, is never quiet. Inside Cairo's shifting halls, factions schemed behind veils. Emirs and commanders whispered in corridors. Al-Nasir Yusuf of Syria eyed the throne, claiming lineage from Saladin. Egypt's Mamluks accepted no distant claim. Their loyalty belonged to their barracks and their bond. Soon came the Battle of Al-Qura in the Delta in February of 1251. Syrian Ayyubid forces marched into Egypt seeking to reclaim rule, but met the Mamluk army face to face. Baybars, Aybak, Husam al-Din, and their comrades defeated them. That wasn't just a victory, it was a declaration. The Mamluks were now Egypt's masters. More than men died in that battle. A legacy died. The Mamluks no longer served, they led. Aybak became sultan for a time, while Qutuz rose among the Mamluk commanders, respected for his strategy and loyalty. By the time the Mongols destroyed Baghdad and Syria, the Mamluks stood ready, not as remnants of a broken dynasty, but as soldiers shaped by fate. Cairo was no longer passive. It throbbed with decision, ambition, tension, and resolve. The Mamluks carried two burdens: ambition and responsibility. Slaves turned soldiers, forged in battle, now rulers of the richest realm in the Islamic world. Egypt was fertile, wealthy, bridging Africa and the Levant. Its markets thrived. Its scholars preserved knowledge. But trade and learning alone would not protect the realm while Mongol banners advanced from the east. In November of 1259, Qutuz seized power after Aybak's fall. He moved swiftly. He executed envoys sent by Hulagu with demands for submission, their heads placed on Cairo's gates as a grim warning. Diplomacy was dead, and war was now declared. He called Baybars to his side. The streets of Cairo froze at the news. Some wept, others cheered. Mothers prayed, scholars pored over maps, soldiers tightened armor. Qutuz and Baybars transformed the Mamluks from rulers into defenders of Islam. They claimed legitimacy not through blood, but through action, steel, and word made true. The term Mamluk Sultanate took on new meaning. No longer slave service, but empire. They united Egypt and Syria, pushed back surviving Crusader holdouts, and began rebuilding cities. But to defend their realm, they first had to define it, not by legacy, but by purpose. Their political system remained fragile. Succession did not follow bloodlines. Instead, whichever commander held the strongest alliance in the citadel, army, and government ruled. Often that meant election among elites, sometimes betrayal. Regicide became routine. Each sultan stood alone. His reign depended on ability to lead and protect. Still, out of that instability came unity. Mamluk identity was loyalty to their core before loyalty to any crown. They trained daily. They mastered cavalry, archery, siegecraft, always ready. They understood mobility, warfare, fear. Now they faced the greatest storm the Islamic world had ever seen, the Mongol tide. Many believed no one could stop it. Baghdad's scholars were gone. Syria's princes fled. The Crusaders shut behind walls. And Egypt watched, no longer passive, but determined. Within months of rising to power, Qutuz ordered mass mobilization. Across desert and Nile, Mamluks and tribal allies were summoned. He forged alliances, bribed governors, whispered to tribal chiefs. Cairo filled with armor's clatter. Banners unfurled. Tension simmered. In that tension, Baybars sharpened not only steel, but mind. He studied tactics. He observed Mongol horse archers from afar. He learned they rode fast, fired arrows in waves, rotated fresh mounts. His own troops used heavier armor and horses. They countered speed with strength. They matched arrows with shields and swords. It wasn't equal, it was clever. Baybars and Qutuz spoke of strategy as men speak of prayer, deliberate, precise, meant to sway fate. They gathered scouts, planned routes, chose timing. They did not rely on prayer alone, but on planning. Mamluk forces gathered near the Sinai Desert border. Emissaries assured Crusader cities they meant no harm. Rumors spoke of a silent understanding. Neither side would interfere. They feared the Mongols more. So the Mamluks passed through. In that march, each soldier carried more than weapons. He carried fate. He carried the hope of families fleeing Aleppo and Damascus. The anger of scholars whose libraries had burned. A silent demand, never again. Cairo felt the shift. The slave army had become the state. The Mamluk Sultanate stood between devastation and salvation. They were unexpected rulers, improbable heroes, and yet rulers nonetheless. As the Mamluks crossed Sinai, they left behind a city filled with promise and fear. Would they return victorious? Or return crushed? Could this new order, born of slaves and blood, stand against the greatest army the world had ever seen? By the time they reached Palestine's fields, they knew this. They would decide not only their fate, but the fate of the Islamic world. On that journey from Cairo to the front, they became more than soldiers. They became a symbol. Against all odds, against every legacy, they had risen. But what awaited them in the hills of Palestine, the greatest force the world had ever known, was yet to come. Would their rise bring dawn or an end? Only the storm in the fields ahead would tell. Chapter 5, Baybars, the Lion Awakens. Smoke still hung in the air over Aleppo when a name began to stir in whispers, like a storm forming over the horizon. That name was Baybars. The Mongols had swept through cities like wildfire, unstoppable, brutal, and godless. But in the rising silence after each conquest, there was one man whose silence did not mean surrender. Baybars, the lion-hearted general forged in chains, was waiting. And now, he was ready to roar. Once a slave, ripped from the steppes of the Kitbuqa Turks, Baybars had been dragged across deserts and markets, bought and sold like livestock. But inside him burned a fire that no master could tame. He trained with a purpose, studied with obsession, and fought like a man possessed. And when the Mamluks, the elite military caste of slave soldiers in Egypt, rose to power, Baybars didn't just survive. He thrived. Cairo was a furnace of ambition and betrayal. Just years earlier, the ruling Ayyubid dynasty had crumbled under the weight of its own weakness. Into that vacuum stepped the Mamluks, hardened warriors who knew only war, loyalty, and steel. Among them, Baybars quickly stood out. Not for his birth, not for his bloodline, but for something rarer, his sheer will to dominate the battlefield and command fear. But Baybars was not a man who craved titles for their own sake. He was a creature of movement, of war. His mind calculated with the cold precision of a general, but his heart beat with the fury of a man who had nothing to lose. The Mongols had burned Aleppo. They had desecrated Damascus. They had driven their banners deep into the soil of Syria. And now, their eyes turned toward Egypt. Most believed Egypt would fall. After all, who could stand against the Mongol storm? Baghdad, the beating heart of Islamic civilization, had been reduced to rubble. The Abbasid Caliph, descended from the Prophet himself, had been wrapped in a carpet and trampled beneath hooves. Who was left to resist? Who could possibly challenge the wrath of Hulagu Khan's armies? Baybars could. The Mamluks may have been born in bondage, but they were not broken. Under the new Sultan Qutuz, himself once a slave, Cairo began to prepare for war. But it was Baybars who truly understood the enemy. He had studied Mongol tactics with fanatical attention. He knew they moved like a river, swift, relentless, and impossible to dam head-on. But he also knew rivers could be diverted and ambushed. He proposed a plan. Don't wait behind city walls. Don't let the Mongols choose the battlefield. Strike them in the open, on ground the Mamluks knew, and where the terrain could be used to blunt their cavalry. It was a gamble, but it was all or nothing. And Baybars was not a man who played to lose. He trained his men with brutal discipline. They rode every day, drilled every hour, practiced archery from horseback until their hands bled. Baybars demanded perfection, not for glory, not for power, but because he knew, down to his bones, that the only thing that could stop the Mongols was fearlessness sharpened into skill. And yet, behind all his command and strategy, there was still the boy who had once been chained. A boy who had seen his home taken, his name stripped, his freedom stolen. Every decision he made now was vengeance made flesh. News came like thunder. A Mongol force under Kitbuqa, one of Hulagu Khan's fiercest generals, had crossed into Palestine. They were scouting, pillaging, watching, testing the southern front. It was no longer a question of if. It was when. Baybars rode to Qutuz. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of years of fire. He did not beg for war. He demanded it, not out of arrogance, but because he understood the stakes. If they waited, they would be crushed. If they stood, they had a chance. A single, blood-soaked, razor-thin chance. Qutuz agreed. The Mamluks would march, not to defend Cairo, but to meet the Mongols head-on, in the Jezreel Valley, near a place called Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. And so began the long march north. Baybars led the vanguard. His scouts moved like ghosts through the valleys. Every night, they studied the stars, mapping Mongol movements. Every day, they trained harder because there would be no second battle. This was it. Baybars was not just a warrior anymore. He had become a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of everything the Mongols had not yet broken. And as they neared the place of battle, every rider under his command understood one thing. The fate of the Islamic world rested in their hands. But in the shadows of the valley, as the wind stirred the long grasses, the Mongols were already waiting. Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The name itself whispered prophecy. Centuries ago, this was where David struck down a giant. And now, another giant stood ready. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Korean peninsula to the gates of Egypt. Unbeatable, unchallenged, unquestioned. Until now, Baybars had chosen this place for a reason. The narrow valley would restrict the Mongol cavalry's sweeping flanks. The terrain, hills and springs, gave hiding places. It wasn't just a battlefield. It was a trap, and Baybars was the bait. At dawn, with the sun burning behind them, Baybars and his cavalry struck first. They rode hard into the Mongol advance force, screaming, slashing, arrows raining down like steel hail. The Mongols reeled from the impact, but Kitbuqa's men were seasoned, brutal, and quick to regroup. As planned, Baybars faked retreat, pulling his forces back, pretending to scatter. The Mongols took the bait. Like wolves chasing blood, they surged forward, roaring into the narrow pass. Victory, they thought, was already theirs. But over the hills, the main Mamluk army was waiting. Baybars had timed it perfectly. The moment the Mongols were deep inside the valley, Qutuz unleashed the full force of the Mamluk army. From the flanks and front, cavalry poured in, crashing into the overextended Mongols from all sides. It was chaos. Screams of men and horses echoed off the hills. Dust turned the air into smoke. Steel met flesh, and arrows blotted out the sky. But Baybars was not done. He charged back into the heart of the Mongol ranks, cutting down enemies with terrifying speed, his sword a blur of vengeance. He was everywhere, rallying men, redirecting flanks, hunting Kitbuqa himself. The Mongol general refused to retreat. Hulagu had left him behind with orders: hold Syria, show no weakness. But now he was surrounded, his men dying by the hundreds. Still, Kitbuqa fought like a demon, refusing surrender, until the Mamluks finally brought him down and captured him. Baybars stood over the broken general, the man who had helped burn Aleppo, raise Damascus, and stain the earth with blood. Now, bound, beaten, he faced justice. Qutuz ordered his execution. And just like that, for the first time in history, the Mongols were defeated in open battle. The victory at Ain Jalut rippled across the Islamic world. Cities once paralyzed with fear erupted in celebration. From Egypt to Baghdad, hope returned like the first rains after drought. The Mongols had finally been stopped, not by a grand empire, not by a king, but by former slaves. Baybars didn't bask in glory. He returned to Cairo, quiet, calculating. But he had changed. He had tasted what it meant to command history. And just weeks later, Qutuz was dead, assassinated under mysterious circumstances. Many suspected Baybars. Few dared speak it aloud. But soon after, Baybars was named Sultan, not by inheritance, not by birthright, but by conquest, cunning, and pure, unrelenting will. As Sultan, Baybars didn't rest. He fortified cities, restructured the army, launched campaigns against the Crusaders, and rebuilt what the Mongols had shattered. He understood the game of empires, and he played it with deadly precision. He became a shadow even the Mongols feared. Under his reign, the Mamluk Sultanate rose as the dominant force in the region. He hunted down Mongol spies, crushed internal rebellions, and turned Cairo into the center of Islamic resistance. But he never forgot what he was. Not a king, not a god, a man forged by loss, a warrior who rose from chains. Baybars had broken the myth of Mongol invincibility, and in doing so, he carved his name into the stone of history, not as a slave, not as a soldier, but as the lion who stopped the storm. Chapter 6: A Diplomatic Ultimatum. They came on horseback, draped in furs, their faces carved from stone, as if the wind of the steppes had chiseled them into grim statues. 3 men, Mongol envoys, sent from the great general Kitbuqa under the command of Hulagu Khan, brother of the mighty Kublai. They carried no gifts, no olive branch, just a letter, sealed and soaked in arrogance, drenched in blood-soaked confidence. The scroll they bore was more than parchment. It was a knife wrapped in silk, a demand delivered not with negotiation, but with the cold certainty of death. Surrender, it said. Bow before the Mongol Empire or be destroyed. As Baghdad was, as Aleppo was, as every city that dared to resist. Baghdad. The word alone was a wound. Just 2 years earlier, the jewel of the Islamic world had fallen. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the spiritual and political heart of Islam, was reduced to cinders in less than 2 weeks. Rivers ran black with ink, the libraries of centuries drowned, and red with blood. Thousands slain. The caliph himself, wrapped in a carpet, trampled to death beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. This was not a threat. It was a promise. In Cairo, the air was thick, not with fear, but with fury. The Mamluks had heard of Mongol brutality. Everyone had. Cities erased. Populations extinguished. It was like watching a storm march across the map, devouring civilization. One by one, great cities had fallen. Bokhara, Samarkand, Nishapur, Herat. And now, they had come to the gates of the Islamic heartlands. But this time, the storm had met a wall. And that wall had a name. Qutuz, the Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, not born a prince, but a slave. Sold, trained, forged in hardship. He knew the Mongols would not stop at Damascus. Their appetites were too great. Egypt was next. Cairo, its markets, its mosques, its minarets, would burn unless someone stood up. Someone made a stand. And so Qutuz stood. He read the ultimatum. Then he did what no one had dared. He tore it up. Not metaphorically. Literally. He took the scroll, looked the envoys in the eyes, and ripped it in half. Slowly. Deliberately. Every tear echoed in the chamber like thunder, as if the very walls were warning him. This is madness. But he wasn't done. With ice in his voice, Qutuz turned to his guards. His next words were calm, almost casual, but they sent a chill through the court. Execute them. The guards hesitated. These were envoys. Under every law of diplomacy, envoys were sacred. You could not harm the messenger. It was a principle older than the Crusades, older than the Quran, older even than empire. But Qutuz didn't care. He had seen what diplomacy got you with the Mongols. It got you corpses. It got you cities on fire. Moments later, the envoys were dragged to a public square. There, before a stunned crowd, the swords came down. Heads rolled. Blood hit the stone. And the message was clear. Egypt would not kneel. But this was no impulsive act of defiance. Qutuz knew exactly what he was doing. He was forcing the Mongols to react. He was cutting off retreat, both for himself and for his people. There was no going back. No compromise. No delay. It was war. And now, the world would watch what happened when the most terrifying empire in history, the Mongols, met the most unlikely of defenders, the Mamluks. The Mongols did not take the insult lightly. In their worldview, honor demanded a response. Vengeance was not optional, it was destiny. Kitbuqa, their general in the Levant, vowed to crush Egypt next, to march into Cairo and erase the memory of this defiance. But here's what makes this moment more than just a clash of kings and generals. This was a turning point in human history. The Mongols had never been stopped. Not truly. Not in over half a century. From the forests of Poland to the shores of China, they had swept across continents like wildfire. Every kingdom they faced had either fallen or surrendered. Until now, the Mamluks were different. Born as slaves, raised to fight, trained from childhood with sword and saddle, bow and blade. Each one was a warrior by design. And their system, though brutal, created something terrifying: unity, discipline, loyalty earned not by birthright, but by blood and battle. It wasn't democracy. It wasn't nobility. It was something else. A brotherhood, forged by survival. And leading them now was Qutuz. But beside him, a man whose name would echo for centuries. Baybars. Baybars al-Bunduktari, the Lion of Egypt. A tactician, a warrior, a shadow in the desert. He had fought the Crusaders. He had studied the Mongols. And now, he would do both at once. With the heads of the Mongol envoys still fresh on the stones of Cairo, Baybars began to plan. Every route, every ambush point, every valley where the Mongol cavalry might be slowed. He studied not just geography, but psychology. Because to defeat the Mongols, you had to break their rhythm. Their strength was in motion. Their cavalry struck like lightning, vanished like smoke. But if you could make them hesitate, just once, if you could disrupt the tempo, you might just survive, maybe even win. But it would take more than strategy. It would take something the Mamluks had in spades, and the Mongols had never tasted in defeat. Rage. Not the blind kind. Not chaos. But focused, righteous fury. The kind born from watching your people massacred. Your cities burned. Your faith mocked. This was not just a war of empires. It was personal. And so, the army gathered. Across Egypt, word spread. The Mamluks were marching. Not just soldiers. Blacksmiths. Merchants. Imams. People lined the roads to cheer. Some wept. Some prayed. But all understood what was coming. It would not be a battle. It would be a reckoning. The Mamluk banners flew under the desert sun, black and green, flapping like wings of vengeance. Horses thundered across the sands. Swords gleamed. Arrows were stacked like firewood. This was no desperate militia. It was a professional war machine. And at its center stood Qutuz. Quiet, stern, focused. He did not speak of glory. He did not boast of victory. He knew what lay ahead. The Mongols were not invincible. But they were still the Mongols. Every man in the Mamluk army had seen the devastation they left behind. Stories of Baghdad haunted their dreams. Whispers of skull pyramids. Fields where nothing grew for years. But still, they rode forward. Because the alternative was annihilation. And then, from the east, like a curtain pulled open, the Mongol army appeared. Kitbuqa rode at the front. His banner raised. His soldiers chanting. Steppe warriors with bows, axes, curved sabers. Hundreds, thousands, hardened in battle, drunk on conquest. Two titanic forces, racing toward collision. Only one could walk away. But as the desert winds howled and the skies above Ain Jalut began to darken, the final move had not yet been played. The Mamluks had one more trick, one more trap, and at the center of it was Baybars, a whisper in the dust, waiting, watching, ready to strike. Chapter 7, Hulagu withdraws. The desert wind carried whispers of fate, sharp and chilling. News reached the Mongol camp like a thunderclap, shattering the rhythm of conquest. The great Khan, monk, had died. Far to the east, in the heart of the Mongol Empire, the death of a ruler was more than a loss. It was a storm that tore through the very fabric of power. Hulagu Khan, the great Mongol commander who had marched from the steppes to the gates of the Islamic world, faced a choice that would change history. The unstoppable tide of his army pressed forward into Syria, poised to finish the conquest that had razed Baghdad and Aleppo. The next prize, Egypt, the jewel of the Islamic world. But fate had other plans. Monk Khan's death was not just news. It was a summons. The great Mongol tradition demanded that all nobles return to the heartland for the Kurultai, the grand council where the new great Khan would be chosen. No general, no prince, no warlord could ignore the call. It was law. It was loyalty. It was survival. And Hulagu had no choice. He would leave the frontier. He would turn his back on the campaign just when victory seemed within reach. The decision rippled through the Mongol ranks like a crack in steel. Soldiers who had never known defeat felt uncertainty for the first time. The great force that had swept across Asia and the Middle East would be divided. A portion would withdraw, heading back east to influence the succession. The remainder, a fraction of the whole, would remain in the Levant under the command of General Kitbuqa. Kitbuqa, a fierce and loyal Mongol general, was left with a smaller force than Hulagu's vast army, but no less dangerous. The men he commanded were hardened warriors, riding fast and striking hard. They had tasted victory and blood, and they knew retreat was not an option. Yet the Mongol army that remained was a shadow of the horde that had conquered Baghdad. It was a fragment of the unstoppable force the world had feared for decades. In Cairo, the news arrived with both relief and dread. The Mongol supreme commander had left. The vast army that had leveled cities was no longer at their doorstep. But the danger was far from over. Qutuz, the Mamluk sultan, saw the moment as both blessing and curse. Hulagu's withdrawal meant that the enemy's numbers were reduced, a rare advantage. But it also meant the Mongols were restless, unpredictable, and desperate. Baybars felt the weight of the moment. The absence of Hulagu was not a sign of weakness, it was a challenge. The reduced Mongol force was still a storm ready to strike. And Kitbuqa was no mere lieutenant. He was a warrior who would fight with the fury of a cornered beast. For months, both armies prepared. The Mamluks trained relentlessly. Cavalry drills echoed in the deserts and valleys of Palestine. Archers sharpened their bows, learning to fire with deadly precision. Infantry drilled in formation, shields interlocked like the scales of a dragon. The Mamluks had a secret weapon, their knowledge of the land. They knew every hill, every spring, every path. They would use the terrain to turn the battle in their favor. The Mongols, meanwhile, relied on their brutal efficiency. Their famous tactic of the feigned retreat, pretending to flee only to turn and strike, was feared across continents. But against the Mamluks, it would face new challenges. Behind the scenes, tension simmered. The Mongol leaders debated whether to hold their ground or retreat further. Some whispered of negotiating with the Mamluks. Others demanded battle. In the courts of Cairo, Qutuz met with his generals, including Baybars. Their plans were cautious yet fierce. They could not afford a mistake. The fate of Egypt, perhaps the entire Islamic world, hung in the balance. Each man knew what was at stake. Not just land, not just power, but survival. The Mongols were not just invaders. They were a force that seemed destined to rewrite history through blood and fire. The final showdown would come near a small spring in Palestine, Ain Jalut. The name meant Spring of Goliath. An ironic choice, as the Mamluks prepared to face the mightiest warrior the world had ever known. The desert stretched endless and indifferent. The two armies moved into position, shadows against the rising sun. Horses pawed the dust. Arrows were nocked. Swords gleamed in the morning light. In those final hours before battle, both sides felt the weight of history pressing down. The Mongols without their supreme leader, facing a fierce enemy on foreign soil. The Mamluks, born of servitude, standing between destruction and salvation. And Hulagu? He was thousands of miles away, racing across Asia, fighting for his own survival and claim to the throne. The battle that would decide the fate of empires was about to begin, without its greatest commander. A question hung in the air, heavy as a storm cloud. Could the Mongols win without Hulagu? Or would this be the moment the unstoppable tide finally broke? The answer lay in the valley ahead, in the dust and blood soon to be spilled, in the spring of Goliath. Chapter 8, Kitbuqa, the Mongol Hammer. The sun scorched the pale hills of Palestine, casting long, restless shadows across a land soon to be stained with blood. In the distance, the thunder of hooves rose like a gathering storm, a relentless tide of armor and steel, sweeping forward with the certainty of fate itself. At the heart of this storm rode Kitbuqa, the Mongol Hammer, a general unlike any other, fierce, devout, and unwavering. Though the Mongol Empire was known for its shamanistic roots, Kitbuqa was a Christian by faith, an Nestorian, baptized in secret beneath the vast Asian skies. Yet his loyalty was as fierce as the desert sun. His allegiance belonged first and foremost to the great Mongol cause. Kitbuqa had carved his reputation on the anvil of war. The bloody deserts of Persia, the ruined cities of the Levant. His hand had crushed enemies with unyielding force. He believed, as did all Mongol commanders, in destiny writ large by the sword. The world was theirs to conquer. Any who opposed the Khan's will would fall, like brittle reeds before a tempest. His forces numbered in the thousands, though diminished from the vast armies that had toppled empires. Yet even a fraction of the Mongol horde was enough to unsettle the bravest souls. Their horse archers, lightning fast and deadly accurate, could strike like the hiss of a serpent, arrows released in clouds that darkened the sky. Their discipline was unmatched, their battle formations a dance of death perfected over decades. Kitbuqa rode at the head of this army, a figure of grim determination. His eyes, sharp, cold, and unforgiving, scanned the horizon, calculating every hill, every valley, every possible advantage. To him, the Mamluks were merely another obstacle, another fortress to be shattered. Yet beneath his armor and beneath his pride lay a man burdened by expectation. The great Hulagu Khan had entrusted him with this crucial mission, to subdue the Mamluks and secure the western frontier. The glory of final victory awaited, and with it, favor in the eyes of the Khagan. Kitbuqa's faith in victory was absolute. The swift fall of Baghdad, Aleppo, and Damascus had confirmed what Mongol warriors whispered in their tents at night. The Mamluks were no different from those before. They would break. They would kneel. And so, as his army crossed the plains of Palestine, Kitbuqa advanced with confident stride, unaware of the tempest gathering in the shadows. The Mamluks, led by the slave-turned Sultan Qutuz and his brilliant general Baybars, were not the shattered remnants the Mongols expected. They were ready. They were waiting. Kitbuqa's scouts reported strange silence in the hills, no sign of fleeing villagers or scattered defenders. This was unusual. Mongol victories often stirred panic, mass flight, and easy plunder. Here, the land whispered of resolve, not surrender. Still, the general pressed onward. He was a man who believed fate was carved by action, not hesitation. His forces moved in tight formations, horse archers on the flanks, heavy cavalry ready to charge, infantry poised to follow. The Mongol battle plan was simple and brutal. Draw the enemy into open ground. Use superior mobility and archery to encircle and annihilate. The Mamluks, they assumed, would flee or break under such overwhelming force. But Kitbuqa underestimated his foe. The Mamluks had studied Mongol tactics for years. They knew the feigned retreat, the Mongol trick where soldiers pretended to flee, only to turn and attack. They understood the devastating power of massed horse archers. They prepared counters for every maneuver. And Baybars, in particular, was a master of such strategy. Like a chess grandmaster anticipating his opponent's moves, Baybars had mapped the terrain, set ambushes, and forged alliances that would tip the scales. Kitbuqa's army was moving into a carefully woven trap. As they neared Ain Jalut, a narrow valley surrounded by hills and watered by a spring, the Mongols believed they were marching toward inevitable victory. But in truth, they were walking into history's first real test. For all their fearsome reputation, the Mongols were mortal men. They bled. They feared defeat. And beneath Kitbuqa's steely exterior lay a man yet to understand the true strength of the Mamluk spirit. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the valley, Kitbuqa gathered his commanders. The next day would decide the fate of empires. Would his hammer shatter the Mamluk shield? Or would the lion's roar from Cairo echo across these hills, stopping the unstoppable, forever changing the world? In the quiet before dawn, the armies faced each other, poised, tense, alive with the knowledge that what came next would be remembered for centuries. The world held its breath, and the spring waited. Chapter 9. The Mamluks mobilize. The desert sky was a blazing canvas of fire and dust. The air hung heavy with anticipation, as if the very earth itself knew that something momentous was about to unfold. In the sprawling lands of Sinai, thousands of Mamluk warriors prepared to move north, into the jaws of an enemy that the world had feared for decades. Under the stern gaze of Sultan Qutuz and the fierce command of General Baybars, the Mamluk army began its march. What they faced was not just a battle. It was a reckoning, a collision between destiny and survival, between a people forged from chains and a force that had shattered empires. The plan they carried was as bold as it was desperate, a gamble that could either break the Mongol tide or doom Egypt to ruin. Qutuz, once a slave himself, had risen with a silent fury. His eyes held the weight of loss, of a homeland burning, of families torn apart. He did not speak much. His strength was in action, in the unyielding resolve that pulled the Mamluks from the brink of despair into hope. Baybars, the lion of the army, rode beside him. His presence was a promise, to his men and to the world, that the Mamluks would fight like lions, not lambs. His mind was a battlefield of strategy and instinct. He saw the Mongols not just as soldiers, but as shadows to be outwitted, storms to be weathered. Their route was harsh and unforgiving. The Sinai was no place for the faint-hearted. Blistering sun scorched the skin. Sandstorms swallowed the horizon. Water was a scarce treasure, guarded by the most watchful sentries. But the Mamluks pushed forward, their armor clinking like a chorus of war. Horses, bred for endurance and battle, carried their riders with tireless strength. Every man knew the risk. Failure meant destruction. Success meant salvation. The Mongols were not waiting behind city walls. They were advancing, prowling, striking fast and hard. Their reputation was terrifying, like wolves who had learned to ride horses and wield bows with deadly precision. Every village they passed whispered tales of fire and slaughter. Yet the Mamluks refused to be prey. As they crossed valleys and mountain passes, Qutuz and Baybars held councils beneath the stars. They spoke in hushed tones, aware that every word might carry the weight of life and death. They devised a plan that would turn the enemy's strength against itself. A classic Mongol tactic was the feigned retreat, a staged withdrawal designed to lure foes into traps. The Mamluks intended to use this very ploy, but with a twist. Baybars would lead a small force to engage and then retreat, baiting the Mongols into the narrow valleys near Ain Jalut. There, the main Mamluk forces would lie in wait, ready to encircle and crush the overextended invaders. It was a dance on a knife's edge, a test of discipline, timing, and courage. The soldiers trained relentlessly. Archers practiced firing from horseback, their arrows striking targets with deadly accuracy. Cavalry units drilled formations, preparing to charge or withdraw at a moment's notice. Infantry learned to hold the line, their shields interlocked like the scales of a dragon. The people of Egypt watched with a mix of fear and hope. This was no ordinary army. These were men forged in the fires of servitude and battle, whose loyalty was bought with blood and brotherhood. But even within the Mamluk ranks, doubt lingered. The Mongols had never been truly defeated. They were legends of fear and destruction. To challenge them was to stare into the abyss. And yet, the Mamluks marched on. Every day brought new challenges. Scouts returned with reports of Mongol movements. Villages burned in the distance, cruel reminders of what awaited if they failed. Yet, each step forward was a step toward destiny. As the army approached the Jezreel Valley, the tension grew palpable. The land was a silent witness to the coming storm. Hills rising like ancient sentinels, springs trickling like fragile lifelines. Qutuz looked to Baybars, the man who had become his right hand and soul of the army. Their eyes met, a silent agreement passed between them. This battle would not just be fought with swords and arrows. It would be a war of minds, of will, of sheer unyielding spirit. The fate of Egypt, of the Islamic world, rested on their shoulders. And beyond the horizon, the Mongols waited, their own drums beating a dark, relentless rhythm. The stage was set, the hour was near, and the lion was ready to pounce. Chapter 10: Allies in the Shadows. The city of Acre stood like a fortress against the endless sea, walls worn by centuries, towers piercing the sky, and gates that had seen the march of countless armies. Yet in its shadows, something unusual was stirring, something unspoken. The Crusaders of Acre, sworn enemies of the Muslim Mamluks for decades, faced a new reality, a common threat that transcended old grudges. The Mongols, a force of devastation unlike any before, a storm of steel and fire that had razed cities across continents, threatening to swallow everything in its path. The leaders of Acre, once locked in bitter wars with their Muslim neighbors, found themselves caught between two fires. The Mongols were neither Christian knights nor chivalrous foes. They were a brutal force that had shattered Baghdad, destroyed Aleppo, and now stood poised to sweep across the Levant. Fear settled in like a fog. And in that fear, pragmatism was born. When the Mamluks began their march north through Sinai and approached the Crusader-held city of Acre, the unexpected happened. Instead of raising their banners in defiance, the Crusader lords chose silence. No attack, no blockade. They allowed the Mamluk army to pass. This unspoken truce was not the product of newfound friendship. It was born from a shared dread of the Mongol menace. It was a silent agreement. Enemies for centuries, but now allies in survival. Behind Acre's stone walls, Christian knights watched as the Mamluk banners fluttered in the desert wind. Their faces bore the marks of battle-hardened skepticism. Yet even they could see the truth. The Mongols were the greater threat. For the first time in a long, bloody history, the lines between faith and politics blurred. The Crusaders knew that if the Mongols crushed the Mamluks, their own foothold in the Holy Land would be next. The Mongol horses did not discriminate. They trampled all before them, Christian, Muslim, Jew, or pagan. This realization was a bitter pill. The leaders of Acre convened in chambers heavy with candlelight and shadow. Their discussions were cautious, fraught with tension. To aid the Mamluks, even passively, felt like betrayal. But to resist risked annihilation. Outside, the people whispered. Traders, pilgrims, and soldiers alike sensed the fragile peace. Some saw opportunity, others doom. The Mamluks, for their part, were aware of this delicate balance. Their envoys spoke quietly with Crusader commanders, weaving threads of mutual understanding. Neither side trusted the other fully. Neither side welcomed the alliance. But both understood its necessity. Baybars, ever the strategist, recognized the value of this silent partnership. The Mongols thrived on division and chaos. Unity, even uneasy unity, was their weakness. As the Mamluks passed through Acre, their ranks moved with purpose but also caution. They were walking a tightrope of diplomacy as much as war. Each step north was a step deeper into the unknown, into territory where old enemies watched closely, waiting to see if alliances would hold or shatter. Behind the scenes, rumors flew. Whispers of secret meetings, exchanged gifts, and veiled threats. Yet on the battlefield, no alliance was more critical than that forged in silence between the Mamluks and the Crusaders. It was a tacit acknowledgement. When faced with annihilation, survival becomes the only truth. The stage was now set for the confrontation at Ain Jalut. Two great armies, Mamluk and Mongol, stood ready. Yet beyond the clashing swords and thundering hooves, in the quiet halls of Acre, a shadowy truce held the fragile peace of a world on the edge. Would this unspoken alliance tip the balance? Or would the ancient enmity between Christian and Muslim shatter under the weight of war? The answer awaited in the dust and blood soon to be spilled. As the Mamluks prepared to face the Mongol hammer, the eyes of friend and foe alike watched with bated breath. For in the shadows, allies and enemies danced a dangerous game, one that would decide the fate of empires. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the world held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Chapter 11. Palestine prepares for war. The wind howled through the valley like a ghost screaming warnings no one could hear. Horses shrieked. Children wailed. The scent of fear soaked the air heavier than blood ever could. In villages scattered across Palestine, an eerie silence crept in like mist. And when it came, people ran. Not because they were cowards, but because they knew what was coming. The Mongols were not just another army. They were an avalanche, fast, merciless, and unstoppable. They had already crushed Baghdad. They had already turned the Abbasid Caliphate, once the crown of the Islamic world, into ash and ruin. The stories had reached even the farthest fields, skull pyramids, rivers choked with bodies, cities emptied of breath and memory. So when word arrived that the Mongols were pushing south again, no one waited to see if the stories were true. They fled. Farms were abandoned mid-harvest. Markets emptied in minutes. In the hills near Galilee, entire towns seemed to vanish overnight. Goats left bleeding in pens, bread still warm in ovens. Palestine, a land of hills and stone and sunlight, now stood hollow, quiet, like it was holding its breath. And at the heart of this anxious stillness stood a valley called Ain Jalut. In Arabic, the name means Spring of Goliath, a place already heavy with legend. Some said it was where David once faced the giant Goliath in the Old Testament. But in the year 1260, it was just grass. A wide basin, surrounded by hills, fed by a freshwater spring. It was beautiful, too beautiful for war. But war does not care where it plants its banners. The Mamluks had chosen it. Not by chance, by strategy. They needed space for cavalry, cover for ambushes, water for horses, and hills to hide movement. Ain Jalut offered all of it. And more importantly, it sat along the Mongols' likely path south, from Damascus into central Palestine. It would be the net in which they'd try to catch the tiger. But the trap was only half set, and the tiger was already on the move. To the north, Kitbuqa, the Mongol general left behind by Hulagu Khan, was advancing fast. He had crossed the Orontes River, torched Homs and Baalbek, and now sat in Damascus like a storm gathering heat. A Christian ally to the Mongols, the ruler of Antioch, had offered support. And most terrifyingly, the Mongols moved with no baggage train, no supply carts, no long lines of slow infantry, just horses, dozens of thousands, moving like smoke, eating off the land, burning everything they didn't eat. The Mamluks knew this, and still, they marched north. Sultan Qutuz, newly crowned and still unsteady on his throne, had led the Egyptian army out of Cairo with one clear goal: stop the Mongols before they reached the heart of the Muslim world. With him rode Baybars, brilliant, unpredictable, and dangerous, even to his friends. Together, they moved like men who knew history would remember them, or erase them completely. But they were not alone. Behind them, Palestine was changing. Locals, terrified but hopeful, watched the Mamluks pass. Some offered water, others prayers. A few brave souls joined the march, untrained but armed with anything they could lift: daggers, axes, hope. Still, many more simply watched from ruined houses and cracked walls, eyes wide and silent. The air in Palestine was no longer quiet. It pulsed, and at Ain Jalut, the Mamluks began preparing. Scouts galloped across the hills by night. Trenches were dug by hand and hoof. Horses were hidden behind ridges. Ambush points were selected with the care of a surgeon's blade. This would not be a battle of sheer force. It would be a hunt, a trap, a gamble. Baybars, with his deep knowledge of Mongol tactics, having once fought them in Syria, insisted on deception. Lure the enemy in, then strike. Break their momentum, cripple their rhythm, and never, never let them regain it. The Mongols thrived in motion. Stop them, and they weakened. But as the Mamluks dug in, the land whispered doubt. Would it be enough? Every soldier, no matter how brave, felt the question clawing at the back of his mind. The Mongols had never truly been defeated in open combat. Not like this. Not by Muslim armies. Not without rivers of sacrifice. Some men scribbled final prayers. Others carved names into their sword hilts. A few wrote letters they would never send. One young Mamluk, barely 16, clutched a wooden token from his mother, a carving of a lion. He told his bunkmate it would protect him. He slept with it under his chest plate. At night, the campfires flickered like stars fallen to the earth. And in every flicker, someone saw the shape of firestorms to come. The Mongols were coming, and Palestine was ready to burn or to rise. Dawn cracked over the valley like a blade splitting silence. The men at Ain Jalut stirred from uneasy dreams, shaking sleep from their bones with the weight of what waited. Baybars was already awake. He'd been awake long before the sky turned gray. He stood on a ridge, eyes scanning the horizon. No dust yet, but the Mongols were close. He could feel it in the earth. They always announced themselves eventually, not with words, but with rhythm. The rumble of hooves, the shriek of wind forced by arrows, the thunder of chaos galloping in formation. And soon, that rhythm would reach Ain Jalut. Qutuz, too, was watching. This was his kingdom to lose now. Just months ago, he'd seized the throne with fire and fury, deposing the weak puppet king who had no stomach for what was coming. Some called Qutuz a usurper. But here, in this valley, he would either become a savior or a corpse. The Mamluk army was assembled, trained, positioned. Baybars had split the force, hiding a large portion of it in the hills and ravines, while leaving a visible contingent exposed in the valley's center. Bait. A tempting, vulnerable morsel. He knew the Mongols, knew how they thought, how they attacked. He counted on their overconfidence. He counted on their pride. And then, the dust came. At first it was just a haze on the horizon. But then the tremors began. Steady, measured, like the footfalls of gods approaching. And finally, over the lip of the valley's far edge, they came into view. The Mongol vanguard, riders clad in leather armor and fur, their bows already notched. Their horses were lean, muscular, and terrifyingly fast. They moved like one creature, a tidal wave of bone, muscle, and precision. At the center of the host, riding high above the rest, was Kitbuqa, general of Hulagu Khan, a veteran of China, of Persia, of Iraq, a Christian of the Nestorian faith, ruthless and devout. His name alone caused cities to surrender without a fight. And now he looked across Ain Jalut and saw the Mamluks waiting. He smiled. To him, this was not a real battle. This was a reminder. The Islamic world had been broken in Baghdad. Egypt would be next. And these men before him, they were simply the final page before the story ended. He gave the order, and the Mongols charged. The valley shook as hooves tore into earth. The air whistled with arrows. The Mongols never charged without softening their target first. Dozens of Mamluks dropped, shields splintered, horses screamed. The bait force began to collapse, retreating, seemingly panicked. Just as Baybars had planned. The Mongols, seeing weakness, pushed harder. They had no idea what waited behind the hills. Baybars watched from cover. He held the signal tight in his fist, a white cloth soaked in lamb's blood. He waited for the perfect moment. Not yet. Not yet. And then he dropped it. From the hills, the hidden Mamluk cavalry exploded into motion. It was like the land itself had opened up and poured out an army. Thousands of horses thundered down, curved swords gleaming in the sun. They crashed into the Mongol flank like a divine hammer. The trap had closed. The Mongol formation buckled, surprised but not broken. Kitbuqa, to his credit, rallied fast. He turned, trying to reorganize his forces, but the Mamluks gave him no time. Baybars himself led the charge, cutting through enemy lines with surgical ferocity. The valley became a furnace of steel and screams. Still, the Mongols fought with brutal precision. They never truly panicked. Even cornered, they danced with death like old partners. The air filled with dust, blood, and fire. The spring of Goliath ran red. At one point, Kitbuqa personally led a counterattack, his horse galloping through a hail of spears. He roared defiance, calling upon his god and his Khan. He struck down 2 Mamluk officers before being unhorsed by a hidden archer. He was captured alive. They brought him to Qutuz. The Sultan looked down at the captured general, dusty, bloodied, and proud. Kitbuqa refused to kneel. Even as a prisoner, he was a lion. When Qutuz asked if he had any last words, Kitbuqa said something few forgot. You may have killed me, but you have not killed our people. The storm returns. Qutuz gave the order. Kitbuqa was executed. And with that, the Mongol invasion shattered. What had never happened before had just happened. For the first time in open battle, the Mongols were decisively defeated. Not by terrain, not by weather, but by men. The Mamluks. At Ain Jalut, word spread like wildfire. Cities that had trembled in fear now dared to hope. In Damascus, the people wept when they heard. In Baghdad's ruins, whispers of revenge stirred. In Cairo, Qutuz was hailed as a savior, a defender of the faith. But glory breeds danger. And even in victory, the knives were still out. Chapter 12, Tactical Chess. The valley was quiet, too quiet. The sun hung low over the hills of Galilee, casting long shadows across Ain Jalut's green slopes. Nothing stirred. No clanking armor. No thunder of hooves. Just wind, soft, almost innocent, curling through the tall grass, as if nature itself held its breath. But beneath that silence lay a trap. Hours from now, men would scream, steel would clash, and blood would soak this beautiful, deadly meadow. Yet here and now, the battlefield looked peaceful, perfectly chosen, like a stage waiting for actors in a deadly play. The director of this drama? Not a king, not a general trained in books, but a warrior forged in fire. A man named Baybars. Baybars Albun Duktari, the lion of the steppe, once a slave, now the beating heart of the Mamluk army. He stood atop a ridge, eyes narrowed, studying the land like a hunter planning his ambush. His fingers tightened on the reins. His jaw clenched. He could almost hear the Mongol drums in the distance. Not yet, but soon. And when they came, they would charge, like they always did, fast, brutal, relentless. But this time, they'd be charging into a lie. Baybars turned to Qutuz, the Sultan, a man just as hardened but quieter, more measured. The two had fought side by side before. They didn't need many words. Baybars simply pointed at the valley below and said, "We pretend to break. We draw them in. We strike when they're tangled." Qutuz didn't blink. "And if they don't follow?" Baybars's voice was flat. "They will. They always do." It was a bold plan, one that danced on the edge of disaster. The Mongols were the most feared warriors in the world for a reason. No one outmaneuvered them. Not the Persians. Not the Russians. Not even the great Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had crumbled like paper beneath their hooves just 2 years earlier. But Baybars understood something most didn't. The Mongols were powerful, but also proud. Predictable. Addicted to speed, to dominance, to chasing down a retreating foe like a wolf chasing prey. That instinct would be their weakness. And Baybars knew how to feed that instinct. How to make himself look weak enough to tempt them, but strong enough to survive the pursuit. The key was location. Ain Jalut wasn't just another patch of land. It was a natural funnel. Gentle hills narrowed into a tight valley hemmed by steep ridges. Perfect for ambushes. Perfect for turning numbers into chaos. If the Mongols took the bait and rushed in, thinking they were chasing a beaten Mamluk force, they'd find themselves trapped, flanked on all sides, with nowhere to run. But this was no simple game. The stakes were unthinkable. If this failed, the Mamluk army wouldn't just lose. They would be wiped out. And after that, all of Egypt, all of the Levant, would be open for conquest. The Mongols would reach the Nile, maybe even North Africa. There would be no more second chances. As Baybars rode down to brief his lieutenants, the tension crackled in the air like dry leaves underfoot. These men weren't strangers to war. But this felt different. One soldier, a young archer barely old enough to grow a beard, whispered a prayer as he checked his quiver. Another, older and scarred, simply kissed the hilt of his blade. They knew. Everyone knew. There was no cavalry coming to save them. No reserves. No magic walls. This was it. Baybars gathered his captains beneath a grove of olive trees. He drew lines in the dirt with a stick, speaking low, urgent, eyes flicking from one face to another. "You will ride first," he said to the forward scouts. "Make noise. Kick dust. Look disorganized." Then he turned to the archers. "Hide in the ridges. Stay silent. Wait for the signal." And finally, to the reserve cavalry. When the Mongols are deep in the valley, when they're committed, you strike from the flanks. No mercy, no retreat. One captain frowned. "And if they guess the trap?" Baybars didn't smile. "Then we die fighting." But they won't. Pride blinds faster than sand. Meanwhile, Qutuz watched in silence. His mind was already in the future, in the moment when the plan would either break the Mongols or break his kingdom. He knew what hung in the balance. This wasn't just about Egypt or Damascus. This was about the entire Islamic world. The Mongols had already burned Baghdad, killed the caliph, toppled dynasties. If they weren't stopped here, now, they might never be stopped at all. But Qutuz also carried a secret. Deep inside, buried beneath the armor and command, was fear. Not of death. He had made peace with that. But of failure. Of letting the enemy slip through his hands. Of watching cities burn and knowing it was because he didn't act fast enough or smart enough. So when Baybars finished outlining the plan, Qutuz simply nodded and said 3 words that sealed their fate. Let them come. And come they would. The Mongols, led by Kitbuqa, Hulagu's trusted general, were already moving west, fast and confident, cutting across Palestine like a blade through silk. Villages emptied before them. Farmers abandoned crops. Traders vanished from the roads. Even the birds seemed to change course. Word of their approach spread like wildfire. In Acre, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, mothers clutched children. Men dug shallow graves, just in case. But here, in Ain Jalut, Baybars and Qutuz were not digging graves. They were sharpening blades, setting the stage, betting everything on the one thing no one had dared try in over a generation, fighting the Mongols face to face, and pretending to lose to truly win. But the final piece had not yet been placed. The Mongols were still days away, which meant the bait had to be perfect. Baybars turned back to the valley one last time, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline. Tomorrow, or the next day, this peaceful field would explode into war. He whispered under his breath, too low for anyone else to hear. Come and get us. And with that, he rode into the dark, as the valley held its silence, waiting. But Baybars, he was already several moves ahead. His mind, like a coiled serpent, had mapped every slope, every thorn bush, every crevice of Ain Jalut. He knew where the grass was wet and where the rocks echoed louder under hooves. His plan wasn't just clever, it was surgical. He would draw the Mongols in and then close the jaws of a trap so fast, so violent, they wouldn't even know what killed them. So the orders were whispered down the ranks like holy scripture. The vanguard would bait the Mongols. They'd show just enough weakness to spark Mongol pride, to make them chase. Then, at the signal, they would retreat, not in chaos, but with precise rhythm, back into the valley, where the real strike force would be waiting like a loaded crossbow in the shadows. It was risky. If the timing faltered, if any piece moved out of place, the whole army could collapse like sand. But Baybars thrived on risk. That was what made him dangerous. He was a man who stared death in the face and blinked slower. As dawn broke on the eve of battle, Baybars rode alone to a hilltop. His silhouette stretched across the valley floor. Behind him, the Mamluk camp was still and silent. In front of him, the kill zone. The stage was set, and in the corners of his mind, he imagined the sounds, the thundering hooves, the screams, the metallic clash of swords echoing off the hills. But something deeper stirred in him, a chill, perhaps, or memory. He had faced the Mongols before. He had seen cities burn and children skewered like livestock. This wasn't just war. This was vengeance. This was history begging to be rewritten. Qutuz, too, prepared in his own way. No grand speeches. No banners flapping in wind. He simply walked among his soldiers. He nodded to each one. Some he recognized from Cairo's barracks, others from distant campaigns. They all looked up to him. A sultan forged not in palace chambers, but on bloody roads. To them, he wasn't a distant figure on a horse. He was the man who ate their bread and drank from their canteens. He was the leader who rode with them, sword drawn, not watching from afar. That mattered. In war, loyalty could be heavier than iron. That night, campfires flickered across the field like stars fallen to earth. Prayers were whispered into cupped hands. Some men wrote letters they'd never sent. Others stared silently into the flames, their thoughts drifting between fear and duty. And in the dark, the Mongols moved. They weren't just brute warriors. They were masters of surprise. They preferred ambushes, swift night rides, burning before conquering. But this time, they were blind to the trap awaiting them. The next morning, just before sunrise, the bait moved out. Baybars and his select cavalry took the lead. Their armor shimmered, but they rode with just enough stagger to look tired, exposed, vulnerable. And the Mongols, ever hungry, ever proud, took the bait. They charged. Hard. The valley trembled. The grass parted under thousands of hooves. Dust rose like smoke signals. Arrows sang. Baybars didn't flinch. He gave the signal, a short blast from a horn, and his men wheeled around. They galloped back toward the valley's narrowest choke. Not in panic, but in perfect formation, like dancers in a deadly ballet. The Mongols followed, confident, reckless, convinced they had shattered the Mamluk vanguard. They had no idea, Just beyond the bend, hidden behind ridges and trees, thousands of Mamluk warriors waited in silence. Shields braced, lances ready. They could hear the Mongol thunder approaching. Baybars disappeared into the valley's throat, the Mongols right behind. And then, the trap was sprung. From the sides, from above, from behind boulders and trees, Mamluk forces poured in like water breaking through a dam. The valley, once serene, became a slaughterhouse. Blades flashed. Horses screamed. Steel clashed like thunder. Baybars wheeled around again, striking from the front. The Mongols, trapped, confused, fought like demons, but the narrow space worked against them. Their famed mobility, their swirling tactics, useless here. They were caged lions. Qutuz charged in with the reserves, his sword raised, voice thundering like a storm. "O Islam! O victory!" he roared, not as a king, but as a man whose world depended on this very moment. The battle reached its peak, and just when it seemed the Mongols might regroup, the final blow fell. Qutuz himself, furious and fearless, plunged into the fray. His cloak torn, his face bloodied. The soldiers saw him, and their courage exploded. The Mongols began to fall, and fall, and fall. But the question remains, was it over? Had the serpent's head truly been severed, or had they simply struck its tail? Because in the smoke, one figure still stood. The Mongol commander, Kitbuqa, alone, his men dead around him, his armor dented, but his eyes burning with rage. And he wasn't done. Not yet. Not while he still drew breath. Not while vengeance still stirred in his chest. The next move would decide everything. And the final chapter had yet to be written. Chapter 13, The Calm Before the Storm. A silver mist hovered low over the valley of Ain Jalut. And in that mist, two armies waited, like titans just inches apart, breathing the same air, yet untouched. But that silence, it wasn't peace. It was a coil wound tight. At any second, it could snap. In the deep hours before dawn, a single torch flickered outside the Mamluk tents. It sputtered against the cold air, casting dancing shadows over the hardened faces of men who knew this sleep might be their last. Horses pawed at the dirt nervously, catching the scent of something they didn't understand. Even the earth felt tense, as if holding its breath. That night was not merely a pause before war. It was a reckoning in disguise. Baybars, the Mamluk commander, did not sleep. He stood on a low ridge, cloak drawn tight, eyes scanning the terrain below. Ain Jalut, meaning Spring of Goliath, wasn't just poetic, it was tactical gold. A grassy valley, nestled between hills and rocky ridges, flanked by dense groves and crags perfect for concealment. It was the kind of battlefield where cunning could beat brute force. He'd chosen this place deliberately. Behind him, soldiers whispered prayers, wrapped in cloaks, sharpening blades by candlelight. But Baybars, he studied shadows. He knew the Mongols were coming. And he knew Kitbuqa, their ruthless general, wouldn't hesitate. There'd be no mercy, no second chances. Kitbuqa, on the other side of the valley, sat by his own fire. A Christian Mongol of the Nayman tribe, a fierce warrior and a devout man, he had crushed cities across Persia and the Levant. Tigris rivers ran red behind him. Now, he looked toward Galilee. He believed this battle would be no different. But this was different. His cavalry, the iron heartbeat of the Mongol war machine, were eager. Men tightened leather straps on their lamellar armor, checked bowstrings, ran fingers across curved sabers honed to razor precision. They did not speak much. Mongols didn't need words to understand war. They felt it in their blood. Yet something lingered here. The valley wasn't as open as they preferred. There were too many folds in the land, too many shadows that might hold swords. Kitbuqa ordered more scouts. He wanted every inch of the field mapped in his mind before first light. Still, a part of him whispered caution. Something was off. But his pride, like the banners fluttering behind him, stood tall. He had faced crusaders, sultans, princes. Who were these Mamluks to challenge Mongol supremacy? Back in the Mamluk camp, Qutuz, the Sultan of Egypt, walked silently among his men. No crown, no robes, just armor and a steady gaze. He stopped beside a young soldier, no older than 17, shaking with quiet fear. Qutuz knelt beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't speak of courage or glory. He said simply, "Your heart is beating. That means you're alive. Fight to keep it that way." That's how Qutuz led, not from a throne, but from among them. And his men loved him for it. Baybars returned from his scouting, meeting Qutuz inside a simple war tent lit by a single oil lamp. They spread the map across a wooden crate. Baybars pointed to the bend in the valley, narrow, easy to trap. "They'll charge here. Fast and arrogant," he said. "We feign retreat. Pull them in." Then, he drew a curved line, a crescent. "We close from both sides." Qutuz nodded. The plan was a gamble. A false retreat required perfect timing and discipline. One mistake and the Mongols would overrun them. But there was no better option. Not against an enemy like this. Both men knew, if they failed here, Egypt would fall. Damascus might burn. Jerusalem would be a memory. And nothing would stop the Mongols from reaching the Mediterranean. Dawn drew nearer. Torches dimmed. And in the darkness, thousands waited. There were no horns, no grand speeches. Just quiet. Just breath. Just the aching, dreadful calm that comes before chaos. Some Mamluks clutched small verses of the Quran sewn into cloth. Others kissed pendants from loved ones. They didn't talk about fear. They wore it under their armor like a second skin. Even the most seasoned warrior knew what was coming would be hell. Far to the north, beyond the hills, the first flicker of gray light crawled across the sky. Baybars climbed to a ridge once more, lifting his hand to the horizon. A scout appeared beside him, dust on his robes, breath heavy. "They're moving." The Mongol vanguard had begun its march. This was it. Baybars turned. Behind him, horsemen assembled. Archers adjusted quivers. Spearmen gripped shafts tight. Their eyes met his. No words passed. He simply nodded. And they understood. Across the valley, Kitbuqa stood tall in his saddle. His horse reared slightly, sensing tension. Behind him, the ranks stretched in perfect order. Horsemen, banner-bearers, drum corps ready to signal the charge. He looked toward the Mamluk lines, smaller, less imposing, but calm. That unsettled him. Why weren't they panicking? A sudden gust rustled the tall grass. The birds that had chirped through the early morning went silent. The valley itself seemed to brace. Then the drums began. Deep, thundering, like distant thunder rolling through bone. The Mongol cavalry surged forward, not in a reckless sprint, but in a calculated, fearsome advance. Hooves crushed the earth like hammers pounding anvils. The Mamluks did not move. Baybars gave a sharp signal, and his front lines began to fall back, slowly, steadily, as if in retreat. Kitbuqa's eyes lit up. Arrogance tightened around his thoughts like armor. He snapped his hand forward. "Press. Crush them before they run." The Mongols accelerated. Spears angled forward. Arrows readied. But behind Baybar's retreating lines, beyond the bend in the valley, hidden forces waited, motionless, invisible in the rocks and trees. Their blades were drawn. Their breath was held. The trap had begun, and neither side could stop it now. Dark clouds gathered slowly over the Galilean hills as the sun fought to rise. It wasn't just the clash of two armies. It was a test of empires, a trial of faith, steel, and memory. In a matter of hours, the future of the Middle East would tilt forever. But for now, in that final stretch of stillness, as footsteps shook the ground and every man fixed his gaze on the enemy, one truth remained. There was no going back. And in the next heartbeat, history would roar. Chapter 14, Battle Formations. The air vibrated with a sudden roar. The thunder of thousands of hooves carved earth into dust, crashing toward the valley like relentless waves. Bent lances, sharpened sabers, fluttering banners. Mongol cavalry advanced like living steel. Their confidence filled the air. They believed this would be a rout. And if it had been any other battlefield, it would have been. Kitbuqa did not flinch. The Christian Mongol general sat tall in his saddle, face blank, eyes cold. His men spread out behind him in perfect formation, heavy horse archers on the flanks, light cavalry in front, drummers beating a steady rhythm to synchronize the charge. It was the Mongol way, swift, disciplined, overwhelming force. They saw Mamluk lines retreating before them, not chaos, but careful withdrawal, a sign of weakness. They pressed forward, arrogance tightening on their armor. The lure had been set, and they bit hard. But on the Mamluk side, the real formation was just unfolding. Baybars, the master of this chessboard, had arranged his troops into precise lines. The front line was visible, retreating, but held discipline as they fell back. Behind them, hidden in folds of terrain, lay reserves, cavalry ready to flank, archers ready to rain arrows, infantry poised with interlocking shields and spears. This was no place for brute strength. This was chess. Each Mamluk unit had a role. The vanguard, the bait. The middle line, the pivot. The hidden reserves, the hammer. In plain language, a three-layered trap. A chessboard in flesh and sweat. The soldiers on the front line knew their role. They tasted fear, yet wore resolve like armor. Their hearts pounded not in panic, but in purpose. Each step back was carefully measured, not to flee, but to draw. Behind them, families of Mamluks held steady on ridges, ready to whet their swords. Some clasped small talismans, mothers' prayers sewn into cloth. They weren't nobility. They were warriors born of survival, bound by blood oath and fear of obliteration. And beyond them, Baybars stood again at the ridge, watching, testing, waiting. His eyes tracked Kitbuqa's lines as they advanced deeper. The Mongol formation was tight, but long, a long spear stretching toward the Mamluk camp. A spear that Baybars planned to break. Kitbuqa's confidence was infectious. His cavalry pressed. They believed momentum would crush discipline. But in the dust and sudden shouts, as horses galloped and arrows split the air, the stage quietly, almost invisibly, shifted. The trap was almost ready to close. The final move was approaching, and the question echoed across the valley. Would the spear shatter, or would the line be broken? The ground shook like a living drum. Every heartbeat matched the rhythm of the hooves, thousands pounding earth and soul into submission. From atop a small hill behind the front lines, Baybars watched it unfold, silent, unreadable. His fingers tightened around the reins, not from fear, but timing. The Mongol cavalry was now deep into the valley, too deep. Their formation, once tight as a clenched fist, began to stretch like a rubber cord pulled too far. The front pressed eagerly, while the rear lagged, uncertain. There was no going back. Kitbuqa had committed. He thought it was pursuit, but it was invitation. And suddenly, the tempo shifted. From both sides of the valley, Mamluk reserves erupted from the terrain like ghosts from the earth. Dust burst beneath them. Arrows launched in synchronized arcs, blotting out patches of the sky. The sound was not a roar but a scream, not of panic, but of power, released all at once. Baybars had split his hidden reserves like a pair of shears, curving inward from the left and right. It wasn't a clash, it was a closing. The Mongol flanks were being swallowed. What had been a single line was now a vulnerable column, hemmed in, harassed, cornered. Kitbuqa barked commands. His men wheeled, trying to realign. But the terrain was unfamiliar, the dust now a blinding cloak. Drums no longer carried orders. Flags waved in confusion. Mongol horses stumbled over uneven ground carved deliberately into their path. Then the second line of Mamluks moved. From the rear, fresh cavalry surged forward, not exhausted, not confused, but coordinated and cold. They slammed into the Mongol center like an iron wave. Spears drove deep, scimitars flashed, and the Mongol confidence cracked. Some Mongol units broke to the left, only to find more Mamluks waiting. Others tried to wheel back, but found the valley behind them blocked. Baybars had sealed every exit. The trap was complete. And still, Kitbuqa did not retreat. His armor gleamed under the midday sun, dust caked in the creases of his face. He stood atop his horse like a monument, a warrior of legend, screaming commands above the chaos. Around him, men fell. Horses collapsed. Arrows found necks. But the general didn't blink. He rode into the thickest part of the fight, swinging his sword with fury not of fear, but of pride. This was not just a battle to him. It was vengeance for the fallen Hulagu brother, for the Mongol name, for empire. But names do not stop spears. Baybars watched it from a distance, eyes never leaving the center of the storm. His strategy had not only worked, it was art. Every line, every movement, every reserve, all had played their role with terrifying precision. And yet, victory was not declared. Not yet, because Kitbuqa still fought. A group of elite Mongols, bloodied but unbroken, formed a final knot around him. They hacked and cut, screamed curses in half a dozen languages. One rider, arrow lodged in his neck, still managed to throw a spear that pinned a Mamluk horse to the ground. The final resistance wasn't tactical, it was emotional, defiant, suicidal. The Mamluks closed in. And finally, Kitbuqa's horse collapsed. He tumbled to the ground, covered in dust and blood not entirely his own. A blade struck his leg, another sliced his arm. Yet he stood, swung again, and roared into the eyes of death. Baybars gave no order. The men knew what had to be done. They encircled the general, and with one final charge, they ended it. Kitbuqa fell, not begging, not retreating, but cursing. The Mongol formation, once a pillar of terror, lay shattered. Scattered limbs and broken lances littered the valley floor. The silence afterward was thick, uneasy, as though the earth itself took a breath. And then, a cry. A Mamluk standard rose high over the field. Baybars slowly rode forward, passing the bodies of his soldiers, nodding once at the men who had held their line. They had not just won a battle. They had broken the myth. For the first time in history, the Mongol advance had been stopped. But the war? The war was far from over. And as Baybars looked eastward, toward the land from which Hulagu had withdrawn, toward the heart of Mongol power, he knew one thing for certain. The horde would come again. And next time, they would come enraged. Chapter 15. A Prayer and a Sword. The night was thick with silence, but beneath it, the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears pressed down like a stone. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint scent of distant pine. Somewhere beyond the camp, the restless earth seemed to whisper warnings. This was the night before the battle. Sultan Qutuz stood before his soldiers, not as a distant ruler, but as a man who had walked their roads, broken their bread, and tasted their fears. His eyes, sharp and tired, scanned the crowd beneath the flickering torchlight. Faces worn by war, hardened by loss, yet still clinging to hope. Qutuz knew what lay ahead. The Mongol horde was a tempest, a force of destruction that had swept through the known world like wildfire, burning cities and shattering empires. Their advance had been swift, merciless, almost unstoppable. Tonight was different. Tonight, it was not just a battle for land, or power, or glory. It was a battle for survival, a battle for faith, a battle for the soul of Islam. Qutuz's voice broke the silence, low, steady, and commanding attention. Brothers, he began, the dawn will bring fire and steel. The Mongols come not just to fight, they come to erase us, to burn our homes, to scatter our children, to silence our prayers. But we are not weak. We are not scattered reeds in a storm. We are the storm. His words echoed across the gathered men. Some clutched their weapons tighter. Others looked down, steeling their nerves. Qutuz saw every emotion, fear, anger, determination, but none enough to break their will. This is no ordinary fight, he continued. It is a fight for our faith, for our families, for every prayer whispered in the mosques from Cairo to Damascus, from Jerusalem to Baghdad. Today, Islam lives or dies. And if it dies here, it dies forever. A silence fell again, heavy, almost unbearable. Then, softly, a ripple of whispered prayers began. Soldiers pressed their palms to the earth. Mothers' verses, fathers' blessings, children's dreams, all carried on the wind like a fragile flame. Qutuz lifted his hand, commanding quiet. We are the sword and the shield. We are the promise of tomorrow. Our faith will not bow. Our hearts will not falter. We fight so those who come after us can live in peace. For every city burned, for every brother lost, we carry their memory as armor. He looked to the sky, dark, starless, and then back at his men. Tomorrow, we ride not just as warriors, but as guardians of our legacy. Stand firm. Fight hard. And when the dust settles, let our enemies know. The Mamluks stood, and Islam stood with them. A chorus of voices rose, prayers, oaths, a solemn vow that this night would not be the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. The men dispersed slowly, carrying his words in their hearts. Some knelt to pray, others sat silently, eyes closed, minds racing with memories of home and hopes for the future. Qutuz lingered for a moment, alone beneath the cold stars. He thought of his people, of Cairo's bustling streets, of children laughing in courtyards, of the call to prayer echoing over minarets. This battle was not just for them. It was for all who believed in a world beyond blood and fire. Tomorrow, the sword would speak. But tonight, prayer was their shield. And as the camp slowly drifted into restless sleep, one truth remained clear. When dawn broke over Ain Jalut, nothing would ever be the same. The final fight was coming, and history was about to be made. Chapter 16, The Feigned Retreat. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the first sound of hooves thundered through the valley of Ain Jalut. It was the kind of roar that rattled bones and shook the very earth beneath it, the unmistakable rhythm of thousands of horsemen charging toward their fate. The moment was tense, fragile, like a bowstring pulled taut, ready to snap. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and the bitter tang of steel. It was the breath before the storm. Baybars, the master tactician of the Mamluks, stood firm on a small ridge overlooking the valley floor. His dark eyes scanned the Mongol lines below, tight, confident, and hungry for conquest. He had watched them advance over the past days, a relentless tide of horse archers and heavy cavalry, an unstoppable force that had already carved its name in fire and blood across Asia and the Middle East. The Mongols were the world's deadliest army, their reputation forged by lightning-fast strikes and devastating brutality. Yet today, in this narrow valley framed by hills and groves, Baybars planned to rewrite history. The Mamluk troops below him were battle-worn but steady. They knew their roles. Each soldier gripped his weapon tightly, sabers curved sharp as scimitars, lances carved from the strongest wood, bows strung tight like the tension in their hearts. The men were not nobility or mercenaries. They were slave soldiers who had risen to power through sheer will and unbreakable discipline. For many, this battle was more than land or glory. It was survival itself. The survival of their homes, their families, their faith. Baybars raised his hand. It was the signal. The charge began. Like a living wave, the Mamluk cavalry surged forward, hooves pounding, arrows streaking through the air. The front lines crashed into the Mongols with thunderous force. Steel clashed, swords rang against armor, shields splintered, and horses screamed as they collided. The first moments were brutal, raw, and chaotic, a savage dance between two of the era's most fearsome warriors. But then, just as suddenly, Baybars gave a second signal. The Mamluks pulled back, not in panic, but with practiced grace. The retreat was swift and orderly, like a school of fish slipping through a predator's jaws, careful not to be crushed, but always moving deeper into the trap. The Mongols saw it immediately. To them, this was weakness, a sign of faltering resolve. Kitbuqa, their formidable general, urged his men forward with a roar. His heavy cavalry, the backbone of the Mongol war machine, pressed the advantage, galloping after the retreating Mamluks, eager to finish what had begun. It was exactly the reaction Baybars wanted. The Mongols bit the bait. With war cries that shattered the morning silence, they gave chase into the narrowing valley. What had been open ground was now a funnel, squeezing the Mongol horsemen into a confined space where their famed mobility and encircling tactics were limited. The narrow valley was a natural choke point, like a hunter's trap crafted by the land itself. Behind the seeming disorder of the Mamluk retreat lay a masterstroke of military strategy. Hidden in the folds of the valley were reserves, cavalry units concealed in groves and behind ridges, archers ready to release a deadly rain of arrows, infantry poised to strike with spears and swords. The Mongols, relentless and confident, were moving blindly into the jaws of a trap. For the Mongol soldiers, the chase was intoxicating. The taste of blood and victory was sharp on their tongues. They had never known defeat like this, never faced an enemy who could outthink the storm they brought. Their horses galloped hard, nostrils flaring, muscles straining. Arrows flew, but many missed their targets, swallowed by dust and distance. Kitbuqa's eyes blazed as he urged his men onward. To him, this was the moment of triumph. The Mamluks were fleeing. Soon, they would break, scatter, and fall. The valley would run red with their blood. But the truth was far more terrifying for the Mongols. Baybars watched as his trap sprung to life. At the perfect moment, the concealed Mamluk reserves burst forth from their hiding places. Cavalry sweeping down from the hillsides, archers raining arrows that darkened the sky, infantry blocking the narrow exits. The Mongols found themselves compressed, surrounded on both flanks by enemies they could neither see nor escape. What had been a long, confident line became a vulnerable column, squeezed tight like a serpent caught in a vice. Horses stumbled on uneven ground, men struggled to turn their formations, and confusion began to ripple through the Mongol ranks. The battle transformed. What started as a pursuit turned into a desperate fight for survival. Mamluk warriors shouted war cries, their blades flashing in the sunlight as they closed in from all sides. Their discipline and patience were weapons as sharp as any sword. Every movement was coordinated, a deadly choreography that strangled the Mongol advance. Kitbuqa realized too late the price of arrogance. His forces, accustomed to open plains where their cavalry thrived, now fought in a cage. The narrow valley gave no room to maneuver. The Mongol advantage, speed and encirclement, was blunted by geography and Mamluk strategy. Amid the chaos, Kitbuqa rode like a man possessed. His face was smeared with dust and sweat, his armor scratched and dented, yet his eyes burned with unyielding resolve. Around him, his men fought fiercely, arrows and spears meeting swords and shields in a maelstrom of violence. Baybars watched from a vantage point, his gaze steady, calculating. The trap was closing perfectly. Yet victory was not certain, not until the Mongol horde was broken completely. For the Mamluks, the stakes could not have been higher. Failure here meant death not just for them, but for their cities, their culture, their faith. Their families back home prayed in mosques, unaware that their survival rested on a narrow valley in Palestine. The Mongols roared, struck back, and fought like demons unbound by fear. Their war cries echoed off the hills, a testament to their fierce will. But even the most fearless warrior must bend to fate. As the valley filled with smoke and dust, Baybars prepared for the final phase. The feigned retreat had done its work. The Mongol horde was caught, stretched thin, and vulnerable. Now came the moment of reckoning. The trap would soon snap shut, and the fate of empires would hang in the balance. Chapter 17, The Ambush Springs. The valley was silent for a moment, a brief, heavy pause where even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the earth erupted beneath a storm of hooves and steel. The Mongol army, led by the fierce and relentless General Kitbuqa, thundered down into the narrow confines of Ain Jalut. They were confident, even arrogant, certain that this day would be yet another chapter in their unbroken chain of conquest. Their long bows were strung tight, their arrows ready to rain death. Their sabers gleamed like lightning. Their horses snorted and pawed at the earth, eager to trample any resistance beneath their hooves. Behind them, the Mamluks' feigned retreat had worked perfectly. The Mongols were now stretched thin, squeezed into the valley's narrow throat, trapped. And that was when the trap sprung. From the rocky hillsides that framed the valley, a sudden burst of movement shattered the Mongols' momentum. From the shaded groves and hidden ravines, Mamluk cavalry charged like thunderclaps, their war cries slicing through the morning air. Arrows soared in deadly arcs, blotting out patches of sky and striking with lethal precision. The Mongols, who had ridden with the wind as their ally, found themselves hemmed in by terrain that crushed their usual tactics. Their famed ability to outmaneuver, to surround and envelop their enemies, was strangled by the valley's narrowness. Confusion rippled through their ranks. What had begun as a confident charge turned into a desperate scramble. Kitbuqa, the Christian Mongol general famed for his bravery and tactical skill, rode at the forefront, his eyes blazing. He could sense the danger, but the damage was done. His trusted cavalry, the backbone of the Mongol war machine, were boxed in like wolves caught in a snare. The battle shifted in an instant from hunter and prey to two cornered beasts locked in mortal combat. The ground was torn by pounding hooves and clashing steel. The air screamed with the cries of men and horses, triumph, pain, and fear blending into a deafening roar. Dust swirled around like ghosts, cloaking the valley in a haze of death. Baybars and Sultan Qutuz directed their forces with calm ferocity. Every command was precise. Every movement was calculated. The Mamluk archers rained volleys of arrows on the trapped Mongols, while hidden cavalry struck at their flanks and rear. One Mamluk soldier, named Hassan, a young rider barely 20 years old, felt his heart hammer in his chest as he charged into the thick of the fight. His eyes locked on the enemy, faces twisted by fear and fury, the glint of Mongol steel reflecting the sun. "For Cairo, for our homes," he shouted, slicing through the chaos with his saber. In contrast, a Mongol archer scrambled behind a fallen horse, breath ragged. His hands trembled as he strung another arrow, his world shrinking to the desperate fight to survive. Around him, comrades fell, one by one, their screams lost in the storm. The valley was alive with carnage, the ground slick with blood, the air filled with the stench of sweat, smoke, and iron. The Mongols, despite their desperation, fought with unmatched ferocity, their discipline and battle-hardened skill still sharp. But the Mamluks were relentless. They pressed every advantage, their unity unbroken by the chaos. The ambush had not only trapped the Mongols, it had shattered their confidence. Kitbuqa rallied his men, urging them to fight harder, to hold the line, to buy time. "Stand like the mountains. Do not yield," he bellowed, charging through the fray, his armor stained with blood and dust. But even Kitbuqa could not turn the tide. Mongol formations splintered. Horses grew exhausted. The relentless pressure of Mamluk steel and arrows began to cleave through the horde. The valley echoed with the clash of swords and the cries of dying men. Desperation twisted faces into grimaces of pain and fury. It was a battle not just for land, but for the very soul of two civilizations. Amid the violence, Baybar's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. "Hold the line. Push forward. Today we carve our destiny." As the sun climbed higher, the Mongol hope waned. Their famed invincibility, the stuff of legends, was crumbling in the narrow valley. The Mamluks fought with the fierce courage of men defending their homes, their families, their faith. Each strike was a prayer, each block a promise. Kitbuqa, wounded and weary, prepared to make one final, desperate charge. The fate of the Mongol horde, and history itself, hung on this last stand. The valley was filled with the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the cries of warriors. The battle for Ain Jalut had reached its breaking point. Chapter 18, Roar of the Sultan. The battlefield was engulfed in a cacophony of war. The relentless pounding of hooves, the clash of steel, and the anguished cries of men and horses alike. The sun hung high and merciless over Ain Jalut, baking the dusty valley floor beneath the soldiers' worn feet and churning hooves. Amid the chaos, the Mongols' once formidable advance had begun to falter. Their lines, once like an unbreakable wave, were now splintered and desperate. Their pride, their reputation, seemed to hang by a thread. Then, piercing through the cacophony, came a sound that electrified the Mamluk forces like a thunderclap, the roar of Sultan Qutuz himself. "O Islam!" His voice thundered across the battlefield, raw with unyielding resolve and fierce pride. The cry was not just words. It was a call to the very souls of the warriors around him, a summons to rise, to fight not merely for territory, but for faith, for honor, for the survival of a civilization under siege. It was the sound of a leader stepping beyond the safe lines, casting aside royal decorum to become one with his men, a lion in the storm of battle. Qutuz charged into the fray, his armor gleaming dully beneath the harsh sunlight, his horse pounding forward with a fury matching that of his heart. Around him, the Mamluks found new strength, their spirits rekindled by their sultan's fearless example. Where exhaustion and doubt had begun to creep, now surged a fierce determination. This was no longer just a battle. It was a turning point. Before Qutuz's charge, the Mongols had been pushing hard, their reputation for invincibility weighing heavily on the Mamluk shoulders. The Mongol cavalry, swift and brutal, had struck like lightning, spreading fear and chaos. But the Sultan's roar shattered that illusion, and with it, the tide began to turn. Every man in the Mamluk ranks could see it, their leader fighting alongside them, a beacon cutting through the storm of arrows and steel. His eyes burned with the fire of conviction, his voice a battle hymn. The charge was contagious. The soldiers surged forward, their war cries blending with their sultan's rally. The Mongols, momentarily stunned by this surge of spirit, struggled to regroup. Kitbuqa rode hard, shouting orders, urging his men to resist, but the fear was spreading like wildfire. The once dominant horde now faced an enemy with renewed ferocity. Qutuz led the charge through the thickest part of the battle, his sword flashing with deadly precision. His horse plunged into the Mongol lines, scattering their archers and disrupting their formations. Each strike from the Sultan was a message that the Mamluks would not yield, would not break. Around him, the Mamluks fought with renewed vigor. The young soldier Hassan, who had tasted the heat of battle moments before, now felt his spirit soar. For the Sultan, for Islam, he cried, charging with his comrades as the Mongol lines began to crack. The valley echoed with the clash of steel and the roar of battle cries. Horses reared, men fell, but the Mamluks pressed on. The Mongols found themselves pushed back, inch by bloody inch, unable to contain the surge. Kitbuqa, sensing the growing peril, ordered his men to form defensive ranks, trying to hold their ground. But the momentum had shifted irrevocably. The fear of defeat, a notion alien to these warriors for decades, gnawed at their resolve. Qutuz's charge had become the spark in a powder keg. The Mamluk forces rallied, pushing forward with a brutal determination born of desperation and faith. This was more than just survival. It was a fight to protect everything they held dear: their homes, their families, their faith. The battle reached a fever pitch. The sun bore down mercilessly, sweat mixed with blood on every face. Horses stumbled and fell. The earth was churned to mud, slick with blood and dust. Yet still, the cries of "O Islam" rang out, a relentless drumbeat driving the warriors onward. On the Mongol side, Kitbuqa realized that his famed horde was unraveling. The trap had turned against them. Their swift cavalry tactics, so effective in the wide plains of Asia, were being strangled by the terrain and the unyielding Mamluk resistance. The Mongols' famed discipline was being tested like never before. Confusion grew, ranks broke, and the realization dawned: Ain Jalut would not be conquered this day. But the battle was far from over. Qutuz knew this victory hung by a thread, balanced between valor and fate. Each moment demanded every ounce of courage and strategy. As the sun climbed higher, the valley bore witness to an epic clash, two armies locked in a deadly embrace, their fates intertwined, their histories forever changed by the roar of a sultan who refused to be broken. Chapter 19, Kitbuqa's Last Stand. The valley trembled beneath the roar of battle, but amidst the chaos, one figure stood resolute, unyielding as the rocks themselves. Kitbuqa, the Mongol general, bloodied yet unbroken, fought on with a savage determination that blurred the line between courage and desperation. This was no longer a commander issuing orders from afar. This was a warrior confronting his own mortality, refusing to bow or break, even as the world around him crumbled. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting harsh shadows over the broken ground strewn with fallen men and shattered horses. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and sweat, pierced by the clang of steel and the cries of the dying. Kitbuqa's armor was dented, his face smeared with grime and streaked with blood, but his eyes burned with fierce resolve. His sword swung in wide arcs, carving a bloody path through Mamluk warriors who dared to come too close. Every strike was a message. Surrender was not an option. His loyal soldiers fought with equal ferocity, rallying around their leader in a desperate attempt to turn the tide. Yet the valley's cruel geography and the Mamluks' relentless assault crushed their momentum like a tide against unyielding cliffs. The Mongols were hemmed in, their famous mobility stripped away, their legendary discipline strained to its breaking point. Kitbuqa's voice rose above the din, shouting orders and encouragements, a steady flame in the consuming darkness. Hold, for the great Khan, for honor and the eternal sky. His words were both command and prayer, a link to the legacy of conquest he carried on his shoulders. Yet even as he fought, a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. This battle was unlike any other. Here, in the narrow valley of Ain Jalut, the unstoppable had met an immovable force, a fierce enemy not just defending land, but defending the very heart of their world. The Mongol general's mind raced, weighing his dwindling options. Retreat was impossible, the trap was sprung. Surrender was unthinkable. The only path left was forward, fight until the last breath. Around him, the Mamluks pressed relentlessly. Baybars and Qutuz commanded their forces with iron precision, directing volleys of arrows and cavalry charges that broke Mongol lines piece by piece. The tide had truly turned. Kitbuqa's personal guard was thinned to a handful of loyal warriors, each fighting with the desperation of men who knew the end was near. The ground beneath their feet was soaked with blood, the cries of fallen comrades echoing like ghosts. In one final, legendary charge, Kitbuqa hurled himself into the heart of the Mamluk ranks. His sword was a whirlwind of death, his battle cry a thunderclap. For a moment, he seemed invincible, a force of nature that refused to be extinguished. But even the fiercest storm must pass. The Mamluks closed around him, their numbers overwhelming. Hassan, the young Mamluk soldier whose heart had beaten wildly through the battle, found himself face to face with the Mongol general. Time seemed to slow, two warriors locked in a moment that would echo through history. With a final clash of steel, the battle ended. Kitbuqa fell, his body broken but his spirit unbowed. His last stand was not just a defeat, it was a testament to unyielding courage in the face of annihilation. As the dust settled, the valley was silent but for the whispered prayers of survivors. The Mongol threat had been broken. For the first time in generations, an invincible force was stopped. But the cost was great, and the echoes of Ain Jalut would shape the future of empires. Chapter 20. The dust settles. The sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows over the valley of Ain Jalut. For hours, the battlefield had been alive with the chaos of war, a storm of hooves, swords, and cries that tore through the morning and into the afternoon. But now, a heavy silence blanketed the blood-soaked earth. The dust, once kicked high by the frenzy of battle, was settling, revealing the grim truth beneath. The Mongols, the unstoppable horde that had swept across continents like a whirlwind, lay shattered, broken in the valley where their enemies had dared to stand and fight back. For the first time in living memory, the great Mongol army had been defeated in open combat. The valley was strewn with the remnants of a devastating clash. Fallen horses lay tangled in twisted heaps, their riders fallen beside them, their faces frozen in final moments of courage, fear, and pain. The once proud banners of the Mongol army now hung limp, torn and stained, silent witnesses to a fallen empire's retreat. Among the Mamluk warriors, exhaustion mixed with disbelief. They had fought with every ounce of strength and will, and now, as the echoes of battle faded, they faced the reality of what they had achieved. The impossible had been done. Young Hassan, still trembling from the intensity of the fight, looked out over the valley with eyes wide and unsteady. His hands were stained with the blood of both friend and foe. "We did it," he whispered, hardly daring to believe the words. The Mongols, we stopped them. But the silence was not peaceful. It was the quiet that follows a storm, heavy with loss and the weight of a new beginning. The survivors moved cautiously, scanning the horizon for any sign of a renewed attack. The Mamluks knew the Mongols' ruthlessness. They knew this victory, though decisive, was but one battle in a larger war. Sultan Qutuz stood at the crest of a ridge, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The weight of leadership bore down on him, even in this moment of triumph. He understood that Ain Jalut was more than a battle. It was a crossroads, the moment where history could pivot in any direction. Beside him, General Baybars cleaned his blade, eyes sharp but thoughtful. The battlefield had tested every tactic, every decision. Their victory was a testament to strategy, courage, and perhaps a bit of fate. The Mongol general Kitbuqa's death echoed in their minds, a reminder of the fierce enemy they had faced. But the victory had broken the myth of Mongol invincibility. Empires that had trembled before the Mongol advance now dared to hope. Yet, as the sun dipped lower, new questions stirred. What would come next? Would the Mongols retreat, lick their wounds, and return with greater fury? Or would the tide of history begin to turn irreversibly? For the Mamluks, Ain Jalut was a baptism by fire, a brutal test that forged them into legends. Their names would be remembered, their courage celebrated. But the valley's silent witness knew the truth. War was never truly over. As darkness crept across the land, the warriors gathered their dead, tended their wounded, and prepared for what the dawn might bring. Chapter 21: The Head of the Dragon. Cairo awoke beneath a sky that seemed lighter, somehow freer, as if the very air carried a new breath, a breath long withheld under the shadow of fear. The city, a jewel of the Islamic world, had lived for months in the tightening grip of dread, whispers of an unstoppable force sweeping westward, a tide of destruction unlike any before. Now, that tide had been stopped. Here, in the heart of Egypt, a message was being carved into history, a message written in blood and steel. At the center of this moment was a grim spectacle, the severed head of Kitbuqa, the Mongol general whose name had haunted the dreams of many. For years, the Mongol army had been spoken of like a monstrous dragon, its vast body crushing cities, its fiery breath laying entire civilizations to waste. Kitbuqa was the dragon's head, fierce, relentless, the embodiment of destruction itself. And now, that head was broken. The streets of Cairo thrummed with an uneasy energy as the procession began. Soldiers marched in tight formation, the weight of victory heavy on their shoulders, but their steps unyielding. The severed head was mounted high upon a spear, draped in symbols of conquest and triumph, a grim trophy that would be forever etched in the minds of those who witnessed it. Crowds gathered along the narrow lanes and wide avenues alike, faces flushed with emotion, awe, relief, sorrow, and a simmering pride. Mothers clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers of thanks to Allah. Elders lowered their gaze in silent reverence, the years of terror and loss etched deeply into their lines. For many, this moment was beyond celebration. It was a sacred release, a turning point from despair to hope. Sultan Qutuz rode at the front, his posture regal, yet tempered with the weight of responsibility. Next to him, General Baybars held his steely gaze forward, the years of battle reflected in his eyes. These men had not only led armies, but had carried the hopes of millions on their shoulders. The victory was theirs, but it belonged to the people, to every mother, child, and elder who had lived under the looming threat of the Mongol advance. As the procession wound its way toward the heart of the city, the symbolism was unmistakable. The dragon's head, the face of terror, was now a silent, lifeless thing. The myth of Mongol invincibility, that dark cloud of fear that had hovered over the Islamic world for decades, was shattered in the dust of Ain Jalut. The people of Cairo understood the gravity of what had been achieved. This was not just a military victory. It was a victory of spirit, faith, and survival. The Mongols had been more than conquerors. They had been a force that threatened the very fabric of society, the culture, the religion, and the way of life that had flourished for centuries. Now, with Kitbuqa's head displayed for all to see, the message was clear. The Mongol tide could be stopped. The fortress walls of fear were breached. The people could breathe again. But beneath the triumph lay a sober awareness. The dragon's head was severed, yes, but the body, vast, brutal, and unrelenting, still roamed the lands beyond. The Mongol Empire, though wounded, was not yet defeated. Its forces would lick their wounds, regroup, and perhaps return with renewed fury. In the halls of power, questions stirred like shadows. What would the Mongols do next? Could the Mamluks, still bruised from battle, hold the line? Would this victory inspire unity among the fractured Muslim states, or ignite new conflicts born of ambition and fear? For the ordinary people, life would slowly return to its rhythms. The markets would buzz once more, prayers would echo in the mosques, children would play in the streets. Yet, the memory of the Mongol advance and the price paid at Ain Jalut would linger, a haunting reminder of how close the world had come to annihilation. The head of the dragon was severed, but the story was far from over. It was a new chapter, one forged in blood, courage, and unyielding hope. The battle had been won, but the war for survival, identity, and faith was only beginning. And as night fell over Cairo, the city's lights flickered like stars against the dark sky, small beacons of resilience in a world forever changed. Chapter 22, Power Reclaimed. The streets of Cairo overflowed with the sounds of triumph, cheers, prayers, and the rhythmic beat of drums echoing through the narrow alleys and wide plazas. Yet beneath this swell of victory lay a pulse of tension, a quiet reminder that even in triumph, shadows linger. The battle for Ain Jalut was won, but the true struggle for power and survival had only just begun. Sultan Qutuz rode into the city on a wave of adulation. His figure was a beacon of hope and strength to a people who had faced the abyss and survived. The man who had led the Mamluks to halt the seemingly unstoppable Mongol tide was now the undisputed defender of Islam's heartland. His name was spoken with reverence, a symbol of resilience and courage. But the hero's path was never free from peril. Qutuz's return was met with celebration, yes, but also with whispers in shadowed corners. The Mamluks were a fierce warrior caste, former slaves who had risen to power through blood and battle. Their loyalty was as sharp and dangerous as their swords. Beneath the surface of unity lay rivalry and ambition, old grudges and new fears. To many, Qutuz was the savior of the realm. To others, he was a reminder of the fragile balance of power, a balance that could tip with a single act of betrayal. The victory at Ain Jalut had done more than just repel the Mongol advance. It had reclaimed the spiritual and political leadership of the Muslim world from the jaws of destruction. The Mamluks were no longer just soldiers. They were the guardians of Islam itself, a mantle heavy with expectation and danger. For the people of Cairo, life began to settle into a fragile normalcy. Markets reopened, mosques filled with the call to prayer, and the rhythms of daily life resumed. But the scars of war ran deep. Families mourned lost sons and fathers. Fields lay fallow where battles had raged, and the constant vigilance against threats, both foreign and domestic, was a heavy burden. Qutuz himself was not immune to these pressures. Behind the commanding presence was a man shaped by years of hardship. Once a slave, now a ruler, burdened by the knowledge that his fate and that of his people were intertwined. His relationship with General Baybars, his brilliant and ruthless lieutenant, was one of uneasy alliance. Together, they had forged victory, but power's intoxicating grip sowed seeds of suspicion. Each knew that the sword that won a battle could also end a reign. Meanwhile, beyond Cairo's walls, the Mongols were not idle. Though their army lay broken, their empire stretched far and wide. Rumors whispered of reinforcements, of new generals rising to avenge Kitbuqa's death. The threat was far from over. Qutuz faced a world balanced on a knife's edge, between triumph and treachery, peace and war, hope and despair. His return was not just a homecoming. It was a moment charged with uncertainty. The streets of Cairo celebrated, but the shadows watched, waiting for the next move in this deadly game. The Mamluks had reclaimed power, yes, but to hold it would require more than swords. It would demand cunning, courage, and an iron will. And as night fell over the city, a quiet unease settled in the hearts of those who knew. The true battle was only beginning. Chapter 23, Baybars the Avenger. The dawn of a new era was stained with blood, not the blood spilled on the battlefield against the Mongols, but the blood spilled in the shadows of power. The man who had stood beside Sultan Qutuz, shoulder to shoulder through the fires of war, would soon become the architect of a darker, fiercer destiny. Baybars, the warrior general, was poised to seize the throne, but his path would be marked by betrayal, ambition, and an iron resolve that would shape the future of Egypt and Syria for decades to come. Only weeks after the victorious Battle of Ain Jalut, when the Mongol threat had been stopped and the Islamic world breathed a fragile sigh of relief, the streets of Cairo would once again be stirred by whispers of conspiracy, of fear, and a secret murder cloaked in the darkness of night. Baybars had been many things: a slave, a soldier, a strategist, a leader. But above all, he was a survivor, honed by a lifetime of hardship and battle into a man who would stop at nothing to protect his people and secure his legacy. His rise had been meteoric, but the crown he now sought came at a terrible price. Sultan Qutuz had been a hero to his people, a man who had led them to one of the greatest victories in history. Yet, within the palace walls and the corridors of power, cracks had begun to show. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Loyalty was fragile. Fear of the future bred suspicion, and suspicion bred danger. Baybars knew that to safeguard the lands of Egypt and Syria, to stand as a true shield against the Mongol menace and internal chaos alike, he had to be more than a general. He had to be a ruler. And rulers, in those times, wielded their swords not only on the battlefield but in the shadows. The night of the assassination was cloaked in silence, a quiet before a storm that would change history forever. Baybars, cunning and decisive, moved swiftly. The deed was done with cold precision, a swift stroke ending the life of the man who had been his ally, his commander, his sultan. The shock rippled through Cairo like a sudden earthquake. The city that had celebrated victory now grappled with the horror of regicide. The Mamluks, a brotherhood forged in war, were shaken to their core. Trust shattered, fears flared. Who could now lead? Who could be trusted? Baybars emerged from the shadows not as a mere soldier, but as the new sultan, the avenger who would claim the mantle of leadership with an iron fist. His rule would be swift, ruthless, and unyielding. The fragile unity forged in battle was now in his hands, and he held it tightly. His ascension was more than a political coup. It was a signal to the world. The Mamluks were no longer simply defenders, they were rulers. Egypt and Syria were united under a leader forged in blood and fire, ready to face whatever storms the future might bring. Baybars wasted no time consolidating power. His vision was clear: to transform the fractured, battle-worn lands into a stronghold that could withstand the Mongol threat and any internal dissent. He moved decisively, rewarding loyalty and crushing opposition. His reputation as a warrior became matched by his image as a ruler who would brook no weakness. But Baybars was more than just a ruthless leader. He was a man shaped by his past, once a slave, now a sultan, and that past drove him with fierce determination. Every decision he made was fueled by a desire to protect his people, to ensure that the sacrifices of Ain Jalut would not be in vain. In the months and years that followed, Baybars would lead campaigns to secure borders, build fortresses, and strengthen the Mamluk state. He would face new enemies, both foreign and domestic, with the same unrelenting spirit that had defined his rise. The Mongols, though battered, were not vanquished. Their shadow still loomed, and Baybars knew the war was far from over. His rule was marked by paradox: a man capable of brutal violence and strategic genius, of harsh justice and unexpected mercy. His court was a place of intrigue and power, where alliances were forged and broken as swiftly as steel on the battlefield. Yet, despite the ruthlessness, there was also a spark of hope. Under Baybars, Egypt and Syria became a beacon of resistance, a bastion where Islamic culture and power flourished amidst the chaos of a turbulent world. For the people, Baybars was a complex figure, feared by some, revered by others. His sword had ended a sultan's life, but it had also carved out a future where the Mamluks stood not just as warriors, but as kings. As Cairo settled into a new rhythm under Baybar's rule, the echoes of Ain Jalut remained a constant reminder. Victory had been won, but the cost had been high. Power was fragile, and the shadows that had claimed Qutuz still lurked, ready to strike again. The man who had once been a slave now ruled an empire, but his journey was far from over. The Mongols still waited beyond the horizon, and the struggles within his own court whispered of betrayal and danger. Baybars, the Avenger, had claimed the throne. But with power came enemies, both seen and unseen. And the battle for the soul of Egypt, for the future of the Islamic world, was just beginning. Chapter 24: The Mongol Retreat. The dust of battle still hung heavy in the air. The valley of Ain Jalut, where the fate of empires had been decided, lay scarred beneath the weary footsteps of soldiers who had faced the unthinkable and lived. The roar of the Mongol horde, once thunderous and all-consuming, had been silenced. Yet, far beyond that blood-stained ground, a silence had begun to settle, a silence born not from peace, but from retreat. Hulagu Khan, the great Mongol commander whose armies had swept like a raging storm across Asia and the Middle East, never returned to reclaim Syria. His ambitions, once as vast and unyielding as the endless steppes of his homeland, faltered. The tide of Mongol conquest, which had crashed relentlessly against city walls and kingdoms alike, suddenly stalled, broken not just by steel and courage, but by the shifting sands of fate and empire. The news spread slowly at first, whispered in marketplaces and mosques, carried by weary messengers across the desert. The Mongols were pulling back, abandoning their dreams of westward expansion. Their mighty armies, which had seemed unstoppable, were retreating, not defeated entirely, but halted, forced to reconsider. For the people of the Muslim world, this was more than military news. It was a moment of profound relief, a breath caught after a long and terrifying storm. The myth of Mongol invincibility, that shadow which had darkened countless horizons, was shattered on the plains of Ain Jalut. The Mamluks had not only won a battle, they had stopped an empire's march. But why did Hulagu retreat? The answer was woven from threads of politics, logistics, and loss. Deep in the east, the death of the great Khan monk had sent shockwaves through the Mongol world. Hulagu was summoned to return and participate in the struggle for succession, forcing him to abandon his ambitions in Syria. The empire's vastness was its strength, but also its weakness. Without unity at the top, its far-flung armies could not push further west. The Mamluks, however, did not merely survive this reprieve. They understood the fragility of the moment. Ain Jalut was not just a battlefield. It was a turning point in history, a hinge upon which the fate of civilizations balanced precariously. For the first time in decades, the Islamic world could look outward, beyond the immediate threat of Mongol devastation, and begin to rebuild. The cities of Syria, once razed and broken, would be restored. Trade routes reopened. Culture, art, and faith found new breath. Yet, even in victory, uncertainty lingered. The Mongols were masters of adaptation and survival. Their retreat was not a sign of defeat, but a strategic withdrawal, a gathering of strength. Tales of their return, rumors of renewed forces, whispered through the wind like distant thunder. The world had changed, but the struggle was far from over. Ain Jalut had halted the tide. But what new storms awaited on the horizon? Chapter 25: The Battle That Saved a Civilization. The clash of steel and the thunder of hooves echoed through the valley of Ain Jalut. But what happened there was far more than just a battle. It was a moment suspended in time, a moment that would ripple through centuries, shaping the fate of civilizations, and the course of human history. To call it merely a victory would be to overlook the gravity of what was at stake. The survival of a world as it was known, the preservation of cultures, religions, and ideas that still resonate today. Centuries after the dust settled and the swords were sheathed, historians look back at Ain Jalut and declare it one of the most important battles ever fought, not simply for its military outcome, but for its profound impact on the destiny of humanity. Imagine a tide so relentless it sweeps away everything in its path, entire cities, cultures, ways of life. This was the Mongol horde in the mid-13th century, a force that had torn through Asia and the Middle East like a devastating storm. Their conquest threatened to erase centuries of progress, knowledge, and tradition. Had they continued unchecked, the world might have looked very different today. But in that grassy valley near Galilee, the Mamluks faced the impossible. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, these former slaves and warriors, hardened by years of struggle, stood firm. Their fight was not just for land or power, but for survival, for the right of their people, their faith, and their culture to endure. The battle itself was fierce and chaotic. Horses collided, arrows rained down like deadly hail, and the cries of men fighting for their lives filled the air. But beneath the chaos lay a deeper story, one of strategy, courage, and unyielding spirit. Baybars, the relentless general, and Qutuz, the determined sultan, led with a blend of cunning and valor. Their plan was daring, a feigned retreat to lure the Mongols into a deadly trap. It was a gamble that could have ended in disaster. But fate, and the will of men determined to defend their world, sided with the Mamluks. The Mongol general Kitbuqa, confident in his invincibility, charged headlong into the trap. What followed was a turning point, a shattering blow that broke the momentum of the Mongol advance. This victory sent shockwaves far beyond the battlefield. It was a message that even the mightiest could be challenged. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. But the true significance of Ain Jalut goes beyond military strategy or territorial gains. It was a battle that preserved a crossroads of culture, where East met West, where ideas flourished, where the arts, science, and faith found fertile ground to grow. Without this stand, the flow of knowledge from the Islamic world to Europe, which later fueled the Renaissance, might have been stifled. The rich tapestry of civilizations that have shaped our modern world hung in delicate balance, and Ain Jalut was the thread that held it together. Yet, this story is not just about kings and generals. It is about the countless lives forever changed by the tides of history. Farmers who fled their fields, families torn apart by war, soldiers who fought and died on those blood-soaked plains. Their courage and sacrifice are the true heartbeat of this tale. Today, as we reflect on Ain Jalut, we are reminded that history is not just dates and battles, but the human spirit tested in the face of overwhelming odds. It teaches us about resilience, about the power of unity, and about how the actions of a few can shape the destiny of many. But the echoes of Ain Jalut also carry a warning. The forces of conquest and destruction are never far away, and the defense of civilization requires vigilance, courage, and sometimes sacrifice. As the sun sets over that ancient valley, we remember the battle that saved a civilization, a moment when the course of history turned and humanity's story was given a chance to continue.